Alrighty, welcome to this training session on an intro to harm reduction. Want to spend a few moments kind of orienting ourselves and introducing ourselves, letting you know who we are. And we'll have a moment a little later for some folks to chime in and let us know who you are as well. So my name is Ryan Villagran. I use they and them pronouns. I'm a training specialist with Housing First University. So I want to tell you a little bit about Housing First University and our parent organization, Pathways to Housing PA, to sort of give you an understanding about why we're here talking to you about this topic and who we are. I know you all have been kind of prepping a lot for your new community that you're kind of bringing onto the church grounds there. And so probably none of this is new to you and our role, but I just want to kind of set the stage here. So, Pathways to Housing PA is a homeless services organization operating in Philadelphia. We've been there since 2008. We're in the North Philadelphia Logan section. And, we use a model called Housing First to provide services to folks. When we started in 2008, we had one clinical team of folks serving about 70 to 80 people who had been experiencing homelessness. Since that time, we've grown. We now have eight of those clinical teams, and we're serving about 600 folks in Philadelphia. And so each of those folks are housed in our scattered site model. We'll talk more about that. But each of those folks has their own apartment or efficiency unit, and we send our workers out to visit with them, hang out with them. We provide space in an office for them to come in and drop in and receive services on site as well. But mostly we're out there in the community doing stuff with folks, going grocery shopping, um, buying decorations for the apartment, going out to restaurants with folks, kind of having typical people experiences out in the world, right? Um, because we use the Housing First model and because Pathways does it to what we call fidelity, right? We adhere very closely to the model. That's very important to us. We're very proud of that. And we've seen a number of outcomes that match what you see in the research for Housing First. And that's because we're doing that model to fidelity. And so we're so proud of that. And I think our outcomes do speak for themselves. And so over the years, other service agencies have come to us and said, hey, what's in the magic sauce? How do you do what you do? Talk to us a little bit more about it. And so in 2019, we started our training and education program. That's Housing First University. So I'm a training specialist with Housing First University, and I get to spend my days and evenings talking to folks about Housing First and about harm reduction and other best practices for service delivery. I warn you, I am very accustomed to speaking to like a case management social worker audience. And so as Renee and I prepped for tonight, we tried to kind of take out some of the lingo and the acronyms and stuff like that. But I want you to stop me in my tracks and let me know if there's something I'm saying that sounds like it might be inside baseball. My background is in mental health services predominantly prior to coming to Pathways, and so I coordinated a day program for folks to receive care, meet with psychiatrists, have therapy, do groups, things like that. And so, kind of the mental health and substance use end of the world is where I came from prior to this. Let me stop talking. I want to kick it over to my co-presenter to introduce herself, and then I'll move us along. Oh, I think we're not hearing you, Renee. I don't think your audio is coming through. The sneakiness of Zoom. It always gets us. How long have we been doing this Zoom world? 4 years now since the pandemic really struck. That's how long I've been doing it, and it's always something new. How coming through, Renee? Not hearing anything. Renee, if you're okay with it, maybe I'll do an intro to you for you and let you kind of keep messing with the audio. Okay. Try to use the test mic and earbud feature while you're playing around there. So I'll share a little bit about Renee. Renee Frank Boyd is a certified peer specialist. And when she gives her own bio, she says over and over again, "I am a certified peer specialist." If you're not familiar with that term, um, within the last 15 or 20 years, a movement of in the social services world around people who have lived experience, whether that be people with mental health diagnoses, substance use disorder, the experience of homelessness, have begun to play a much stronger role in providing care to people also receiving services, right? And that's based on this premise that folks can have a better understanding about what's going on for the person across from them, right? And so that's a big part of Renee's story as a certified peer specialist. She's been at Pathways to Housing PA since about 2015, on and off. She's actually worked for Pathways several times in various capacities, as a CPS on one of our clinical teams, as a medication assisted treatment care manager. In other words, a person who helps get people connected to methadone, Suboxone, these um, medication for opioid use disorder medicines. And now we are so lucky to have her in our training department, sharing some of that lived experience, sharing some of that best practice that she has gained over the years. That is Renee. Let me check back in with you, Renee. You don't look happy. No, we can't hear you. Renee, I wonder, can I suggest maybe just like taking your earbuds out and putting them in your case so that they're like disconnected? Maybe just using the laptop on its own.
Can you hear me now? Yes, yes. Okay. Okay. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. But wait, now I can't hear. Okay. You can hear me, but now I got to switch the speaker.
Testing, testing. Can you hear
Okay, I
us,
can hear
Renee?
you. I can
You're
hear
good.
you.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Woohoo!
Sorry about that. Please forgive me, technology. Thank you so much, Ryan, for doing my intro. You did a wonderful job. Thank you so much.
Anything else you want to add?
Just that I'm really passionate about harm reduction. As Ryan said, I am a certified peer specialist and I have used harm reduction in my own recovery journey. I find it very, like I'm very passionate about having these conversations with our participants when I was doing direct service. I'm a trainer now, so I did very much enjoy talking to people like yourselves. But I just want to let you guys know that I'm very passionate about harm reduction and look so much forward to having this discussion with you. Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
All right, some quick housekeeping. We are inviting folks to be present with us. I bet that's not going to be a problem with this group. Sometimes when we talk to people in the middle of their workday, it's easy to see that they're multitasking, they're checking emails, they're doing other stuff. And so just a gentle invitation to be present with us. I will say probably a couple times tonight that would rather have a dialogue with you today, and I'm welcoming people to like unmute themselves and chime in. Please feel free to use the chat. That's because it feels so much better to have a discussion with people than to kind of talk into the void in this little Zoom land that we're in. So in that vein, we are welcoming questions and comments throughout. We will have an extended Q&A period at the end of the session today, but I think if you're waiting to ask your question at the end, it's too long. I would love for you to kind of have a thought, have a comment, have some feedback, and let's get into it right in the spot. That will feel much more like a dialogue. And I think as you have questions, other people may have those same questions or similar questions, and it'll generate some good creativity there. I don't think we have any social workers in the room, but if there are, feel free to let us know and we can give you CE credit for this session. We typically give attendance certificates to everybody that attends. If that's helpful for you or useful or interesting at all, the way that you would get that is simply by completing our course evaluation at the end. I also want to invite everybody to complete our course evaluation just to give us feedback about what you thought, what you learned, what you didn't. Any other thoughts? I see John made it in and saying hi. Hello. So we're going to put a link in the chat to the course evaluation right at the end of the session. It'll be a little Google form, won't take you but 2 or 3 minutes, and you can give us that feedback at the end tonight. We're planning on taking 2 short breaks during the training, 2 little 5-minute breaks to kind of like stretch our legs, get some water, take a breather. I think with a long session like this tonight, it's a 3-hour session. We're gonna want that to kind of just keep our brains connected and energized. Don't feel like you need to kind of write things down furiously or take screenshots of the slides that you see today. We are going to send out copies of the materials after the session tonight. So you can look out for that in the email that you registered on Zoom through. If there are folks here that really wanted a copy of those materials, but you know that they're not going to be here tonight, we're going to send a link to all the materials to John at the end of the session, so he'll be able to disseminate that. Accommodations. Wanted to make a quick word here about accommodations. We did try and ask for accommodation requests on the Zoom registration form, and we've attempted to meet any requests that came in. In that vein, we do have the captioning enabled, so you can click show captions if having the text on your screen is helpful. We are going to also attempt to read questions and comments aloud from the chat if you're kind of following along in an audio way. We've attempted to make high contrast text and backgrounds. Hopefully that's visually accessible. And if there's anything we can help you with as we go through the training today, something to help your learning be enriched, please feel free to privately message either Renee or myself, and we'll see what we can do to help you as we go. All right, Renee, you want to take the agenda?
Sure. So for today's agenda, we done some welcome and some introductions. We will do a check-in activity. We will also go over some harm reduction values. We will go over stigma and its impact. We will talk about some applications of harm reduction, some practices and some applications of harm reductions. We will also discuss the goals, the limitations, and the outcomes of harm reduction. And then at the end, we do have some time set aside for questions and answers. But just like Ryan said, if you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to ask those questions. You don't have to wait until the end. And then for our learning objectives today, we hope by the end of our session that you will be able to define stigma and explain its impact on people who use drugs and or engage in other risky behaviors. We also hope that you'll be able to identify at least 2 ways you engage in daily harm reduction practices, as well as explain safety and bodily autonomy as the primary goals of harm reduction. And so right now we do have a temperature check. It's a poll. So Ryan just launched the poll. And so all you have to do is answer the yes. So tell us how you really feel about harm reduction. So the first one says, I am a strong supporter of harm reduction. I consider myself a harm reductionist. If you choose that, if that's how you feel, if you are strong, if you believe in harm reduction, and you consider yourself a strong, harm reductionist, then choose the first option. The second one says, there are some things I agree with, but I'm not 100% sold on harm reduction. If that's how you feel, then please choose the second option. And then number 3 says, I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about harm reduction. You're on the fence. You're still trying to figure out what this harm reduction thing is all about. If that's how you identify yourself, choose number 3. And then the last option is, I am not a supporter of harm reduction. I am not feeling it. I don't believe in it. And that's okay. If that's how you feel, please choose option number 4 so we can just see where everyone is, do a little temperature check with everyone. And so from looking at the answers, and I do want to say thank you for everyone that answered the questions, that answered our poll. So I do see, let's see, it's still going. One thing I noticed about the poll is no one has chosen I am not a supporter of harm reduction. Okay, so I'm giving a few more seconds. I see the numbers still moving, but so far it looks like 45%, 47% of you feel like you're a strong supporter of harm reduction. You could consider yourself a harm reductionist. And then there's 25% of you who say there are some things you agree with when it comes to harm reduction, and you're not 100% sold yet. And then there's 28% that says, I'm still trying to figure it out. I still want to learn some things about harm reduction before I make a decision. And like I said, no one has chosen. It's 0% for the last option. I am not a supporter of harm reduction. Okay.
I did get a couple one message, and then I
Okay.
see some messages in the general chat that folks are maybe unsure where they fit here because they don't really know what it is yet, right? And so and that's okay. We wanted to kind of just get a quick temperature on like where you're at, even prior to defining what we mean by harm reduction. And so perhaps you're somebody that fits into the I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about it if you're not sure what it is yet. And then I see Marion in the chat. I'm sold, but need to learn, practice on how best to do so. I love it. I love it. You're looking for that concrete strategy. I will say this training as an intro to harm reduction sometimes talks a little bit less about what, let's give an example. Syringe exchange is a commonly understood example of harm reduction. We're not going to talk about how to do syringe exchange today, right? But I want to talk about the principles that underlie that intervention. And that'll give us the power to kind of take any intervention that we do or engage with people in any way that we engage with people and understand it in a harm reduction way. Any other kind of thoughts or comments here as we move along? Cool.
All right. Thank you again for everyone who answered the poll. So if any, we welcome, you can use the chat. You can, I guess, come off mic. But we want to know your name. We want to know what it is that you'll be doing, your job role. And then we would like to know one word that comes to mind when you hear the term harm reduction. It could be any word. Just what word comes to mind when you hear the term harm reduction?
Where are we supposed to put this stuff?
Hi, is it Rita?
Yeah, where are we supposed to put this stuff?
You can use the chat. Do you see the chat function?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Or
Thanks.
if you want, you can use the mic too.
Yeah, you're already unmuted, Rita.
You're
Give us your
already-
thoughts out loud if you're feeling uncomfortable.
I'm sorry.
It's
Well,
okay.
my name is Rita Pendry, and my one word is compassion.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you.
Will be lots of clouds with a high of 85 degrees Fahrenheit and a low of 62 degrees.
My name is Anne. I'm the Minister of Music, so I'll be around a lot. And I think my word is respectful.
Okay. I like that. That's really respectful. Okay. And I see people putting things in the chat. I see Jane, Walworth, D, Elder, essential. I see the word essential. I like that for the word that comes to mind when you think of harm reduction. Kelly put safety. I see Susan, she put context. Okay. Lori says, how firm are you on the, oops, wait a minute. One word answer. Is that what that says?
You can expand.
Proactive.
It's okay, Lori. You
Mhm.
can give us at least 3 words as a maximum. How about that?
Patience. Marilyn says patience. Marion says supportive. I see beyond substance abuse. Okay. Love. I love it. Flexible, trusting. Okay. Mark says process. It's a process. Francis also says respectful. I love these words that come to your mind when you hear the term harm reduction. Thank you so much. All right. So we're gonna talk about harm reduction today. And we can do this. I do understand that any conversation, any discussion around substance use can be uncomfortable, excuse me. And is it in my comfort zone to talk about this, to have a conversation with you around harm reduction, around substance use? Maybe not. But is avoiding the discomfort more important than having these conversations about ways to reduce harm? No, I don't think so. So if the goal is to support folks to survive, to save lives, then avoiding these uncomfortable conversations is more risky than not talking about it. Discomfort, being comfortable, just having conversations that we, are comfortable with, does not equate to our participants or our residents being safe. So I just wanted to put that out there before we begin that, substance use, harm reduction, it could be uncomfortable. It could be, we're talking about some touchy subjects, but I think that it's worth it to have these conversations, especially if what we want to do is save lives and reduce the harms of our people. All right, thank you. I'll pass it over to Ryan.
All right. And, I'm thinking about Mark's comment just a little bit ago, saying there are, of course, like a lot of people that are not supporters of harm reduction. And when you're having those conversations with people, maybe one thought, let me go back to that slide. I think this speaks to that a little bit, right? We're starting to touch into this, right? Where some people are like, no, like it is inherently bad to use drugs, for example. And you'll see that we like to kind of expand our ideas of harm reduction to not just drug use, but other risky behaviors, right? Some might consider it risky, for example, to have a mental health diagnosis and choose not to take medication, right? So there maybe is some risk there. And so for us at Pathways and in a Housing First context, we apply harm reduction to kind of a broader spectrum of risk behavior. We will talk a lot about drugs today because I think it's easy to it's concrete. We sort of know what drug use is. We can understand that it's inherently risky, and we can apply these concepts. And so this brings me to this another idea I wanted to share. We're here because you're kind of opening up a Housing First residence, right? And why are we talking so much about harm reduction? What's the point here? And I'll say that there are harm reduction programs all throughout the country. Not all of them are also housing programs, Housing First programs, right? And so it's possible to have harm reduction without the housing component. I gave an example earlier of a syringe exchange, right? And that's a very common example where you have these mobile vans that go into neighborhoods with a lot of drug users, especially injection drug users, and they exchange used needles for ones that have been unused, right? And the purpose there, as a public health intervention, is to reduce the transmission of Hep C and HIV and other things, right? Also, reduce the chances of abscesses. You've got usually medical staff there on site, right? Great public health intervention, in my estimation. Nothing to do with housing, right? So you can have harm reduction without housing and without Housing First. From our perspective, you cannot have Housing First without harm reduction. It is core to the model. And so that's why we wanted to kind of open this two-part series here with the harm reduction piece. We want you to understand these values, these principles, because we're going to be applying harm reduction throughout a Housing First intervention. It's core. So kind of wanted to lay some of that context. Here's a little more context that I want to share. This is a statement on truths and values. And so Ryan wants to speak about themselves for just a moment. I think I'm an expert on myself, right? Renee is not an expert on me. Ryan's mom is not an expert on me, even though she thinks so. Not anymore, Mom. I'm the only one who's lived in this body for this number of years, right? I think people can probably relate to that, sort of knowing your own mind best, knowing that you know yourself best, and you're your expert, right? And as the expert of my own life, I think I get to determine my life's outcome, or at least get to attempt to. And sometimes while I'm doing that, I am going to do some things that other people might consider risky. I'll give you a little silly example. I'm a rock climber. I love to climb, and I do so without ropes sometimes. Ooh. And people in my life sometimes don't like that, right? But I get to determine my own life's outcome, right? I sometimes get to make a risky choice for whatever that brings to me. Some fulfillment, some excitement, an adrenaline rush, whatever that brings to me, right? But I think even while I'm making some of those risky choices, I think I still deserve love and respect from those folks around me, right? And when I have that, when I can see that I'm my own expert, when I um, believe that I can determine my life's outcome and will still receive support even when I make risky choices, I really do think this last statement on the screen, that the possibilities for my future are endless, right? I think it's a very glass half full sort of view. And I like that. I like that a lot. And so when I think about the folks that we serve, or the folks that are living in our communities in a Housing First type program, I think the same things are true. And I think this is very different from how I kind of came up in the social work world. And we've seen some changes in the way that people receive care, where now we're understanding that people are experts on their own lives. And so where typically in the past we would make treatment plans and I would tell the person across from me what their treatment is going to look like. Nowadays it's much different. It's about you tell me, here's a blank sheet. What are your goals and how can I support you in arriving there, right? And sometimes the folks that I'm serving are going to choose things that I am like scared of for on their behalf. That is a scary thing that you're doing. Or like that is a thing that seems like it's going to be harmful to you or going to be harmful to your sort of long-term living situation. You're maintaining tenancy in a unit, right? But despite some of those risky choices, I think folks still deserve our love and respect. And I do think love is a word that social service providers sometimes shy away from. I bet you as a church community have less difficulty using that word around people that I think need care. I'm not afraid of that word, even in kind of a boundaried, ethical service provider relationship. I think it's an important way that we see people and be with people. And so in the social work world, there is a concept called unconditional positive regard, which is not dissimilar from unconditional love, right? And so I think that I think is the parallel that we sometimes draw in our world. And when I say that possibilities are endless for the folks we serve, there are folks in our permanent supportive housing context at Pathways to Housing PA who have been there for many years. They may end their lives as participants in our program, and we're okay with that. We've set it up so that they can. They will always have a stable base to kind of launch out from. And there are folks who have done so well with a little support along the way that they don't need us anymore. That they're able to move, maybe flip into a city Section 8 voucher or some other way of retaining housing, and they simply don't need our intense level of care anymore. And I love that for them because they're just living their lives the way we're all living our lives, and they're not kind of bolted into a program forever, right? We're not keeping them here. When they're ready to move on from us, great, but there's no expectation that they have to. So those are some truths and values that I think underlie a bit of what we're going to continue talking about today. Okay, let's start talking about assumptions. Actually, let me pause. Any questions or comments so far? I know we're kind of ramping up very slowly, inching our way into what harm reduction really is. Okay. So let's unpack some assumptions. Let's take off our very caring and supportive community hats and tap into some of the words or thoughts that might come to mind when we think about drug users. Maybe how the media portrays drug users, or maybe how Hollywood does. These sort of stereotypes that might be out there. Think of some of those words or thoughts, and if you wouldn't mind, put some of that in the chat. What do you usually think of when you think of a drug user? We'll give folks a moment to kind of think and type. And if you want to unmute, that's okay with me too. I see the word desperate. I see the word dangerous. I see the word potentially violent. I'm kind of from these first couple comments, I'm catching this idea that like there is there's maybe an unpredictability there, right? I see the word criminals, folks maybe that lie. Oh, Marion indicates maybe folks that are hurting, and I think there you're starting to kind of tap into some deeper reasons, right? Scary to those around them, right? Or people in the in community with folks who use drugs. I see the word family members. I'm not sure if I quite understand that. Maybe perhaps I could take that to mean that you have family members who are drug users. Yeah, I see you shaking your head, Rita. Criminal, lazy, poor, and then also this idea of scary ways to live. Yeah. And I think tapping back into that, like that conversation that Renee was guiding us through, lifestyles that are very unfamiliar to us do kind of appear very scary. Absolutely. Addicted, selfish, a lot of words here in Rachel's comment: hurt, sad, seeking comfort, not in control. I love it. Really kind of well-rounded, still a bit trauma informed. Manipulative. Yeah, that comes up a lot for folks, right? Willing to do whatever, hurt whoever to get my needs met as a drug user, right? People we know, anyone. I like it. I like it. Self-medicating. Yeah, such good stuff coming up from the chat. Secretive. Linda and Jim, I like this statement. This is an interesting and provocative statement. All are drug users. Some are more dangerous than others. That's interesting. Got me thinking there. Can't be trusted. Mark, also want to go with anyone, people who are hurting. So it could be anybody. Ooh, Lori. Lori, I get on a pretty big soapbox on this. There is an idea, and tapping back into Mark's comment about having conversations with people who are not harm reduction supporters, there's an idea out there that the only way to kind of make any progress in a recovery sense is for people to hit bottom, hit rock bottom. And so a little bit of I won't jump all the way into my soapbox, but a little bit of that soapbox is that we only really know where bottom is in retrospect, in hindsight. And so it's kind of allowing a lot of suffering to occur in the meantime. And then sometimes we're vindicated when somebody says, yeah, I hit bottom and I made the right choice. But sometimes people die. And I think that's the concern. Okay. Let's move on. There's a lot there. You all kind of hit on a lot of it. In our setting, the kind of common stuff is you're either lazy or crazy, right? Something there's mental health challenges, or there is some other sort of moral failing. And this is why a person is a drug user, period, the end. I think the reality is, I know that the reality is, there are all types of people who use drugs. Drug users are some of our friends, our family members, as Rita mentioned, are their loved ones, professionals in our lives, whether we know it or not, are using drugs. I think we all know or love someone who uses substances, and maybe some of us have struggled with it ourselves here today. More often than not, though, we don't acknowledge drug users like the folks on this slide, right? These kind of people who maybe look a little bit more put together. I think acknowledging that these also can be and are drug users maybe forces us to admit some uncomfortable things about some of our loved ones, or maybe that there's not much distance between me and that person who's on the street really looking rough and living rough, right? I think it's easier for us to, as human beings, to judge people we don't know, or people who we think are different from us, right? And so the media does play a role here, right? The media teaches us that you can't be successful or healthy and also use drugs, right? All of this leads to this concept here of stigma. So I want to cue you up here, Renee, to tell us a little bit more about this idea of stigma.
Yes. So stigma. Stigma, like the slide says, the definition of stigma is a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. An example of stigma is the stigma of having gone to prison will always be with me. So we know that when individuals are arrested and they go to prison and they do some time and then they get out, there is a negative, just like a negative connotation around this person. So there's a stigma around this person. This person is discriminated against when it comes to things like housing, finding a job, all of the, benefits. There's a stigma around being in jail and having a criminal record. There also is a stigma around substance use, around drug use, and around people who use drugs. So I'm gonna throw it back out to you guys, and feel free to use the chat. But what other words come to mind when you think of stigma? When you hear the word stigma, I know I said like discrimination, but what other words come to mind when you think of stigma, when you hear the word stigma? And I'll give you a few minutes to put it in or a few seconds to put it in the chat. I see Ellie, she says shame. Absolutely. We're going to talk about shame along with stigma and how it relates to harm reduction. Yeah. I see other. Yeah. Ian said other. I see prejudice, embarrassed, Alzheimer's disease. Robbie, are you saying that like conditions like Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's disease is stigmatized?
Yes.
Okay. Understand. Yeah. I see
I'd
baggage.
like to
sorry.
invite people as you're, no, go ahead. As you're putting in other things that are stigma, I'd like to see more of kind of along the lines of Robbie's thoughts there. Like what other identities or behaviors are stigmatized also? When you look on the landscape of like who's out there in the world, who are stigmatized in our world?
Ooh, Ellie's got a good one. Being overweight.
Being what? I'm sorry.
Overweight.
Being overweight. Homeless, people of color. Yeah. Mental illness, divorcees. Okay. Gender non-binary. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. These are good. Sometimes the Southern. Okay, Lori. Poor, being poor is stigmatized. Yes, the members of the LGBTQ community. Yep, these are all identities and that are stigmatized identities. What about like people who have HIV or hepatitis, or being homeless? What about people who have sex for money? Yes, I see chronic illnesses. All of these groups, these populations of people, these identities, they are stigmatized. And another definition for stigma is harmful, negative perceptions of individuals, groups, or behaviors related to substance use, sexual practice, and health statuses, and all types of risky behaviors. And another important thing to recognize when it comes to stigma is that stigma harms vulnerable populations, the populations of people who are already pushed to the limits of society. These are the people who are stigmatized on a constant basis. Yes. All right. So we talked about stigma. Let's now get into the purpose and the impact of stigma. So I'll put these on the slide, and you'll see that on the left, we have the purpose of stigma, and then on the right we have the impact. So we know that one of the purposes of stigma is magnifying the differences of groups. Like if a certain group is different from mainstream society, then they're stigmatized, and the purpose and the impact of that is to keep people out. And so when people feel stigmatized, they don't talk about their problems and they don't ask for help. And this increases, negative consequences. And so it increases dangerous situations as well. And so another purpose of stigma is danger. Like this, when people feel stigmatized, they feel that certain situations become dangerous and they stay away. And so that's the impact of it, is to keep people away. And then we have discrimination, which is a purpose of stigma to discriminate against different, identities, different behaviors, different groups of people. And the impact of discrimination is to keep people down. And so another thing when it comes to like the purpose and the impact of stigma is to understand how it might be harder for minority individuals from minority groups to seek care, like medical care, when they need it, because some healthcare providers are not always affirming or are not knowledgeable, and often don't provide the care that these people are coming, the care that they need, the people that come from like different minority groups, the care that they need, they're not receiving. And it's because
Renee,
of, impact and the purpose of impact. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I wanted to kind of cue you up for this because I know you've done a ton of like part of our work is to help people access medical care, right? And so often our workers are accompanying people to the emergency department or other medical visits. And we see this process play out a bit there, right? Where you've got like a large hospital system and the doctors there are not necessarily kind of focused on a harm reduction approach. Renee, I wonder if you have any kind of thing that you can share about the way that that plays out for our folks and like what happens when they go to seek care and they're
Sure.
like an obvious drug user.
Yep. So I know in the introduction part when I was having technical difficulties, Ryan explained that I used to be an MAT care manager here at Pathways to Housing, and as an MAT care manager, I supported our participants who have an opiate use disorder diagnosis. MAT, thank you so much, Wes. Thank you for putting that in the chat. MAT is an acronym and it stands for medication assisted treatment. So yes, so our participants who have an opiate use disorder diagnosis, people who use opioids, fentanyl, heroin, any type of opioids, they can use different kind of medications to help them recover or, either get off of the opioids or just lessen the use, lessen the harm. And some medications are methadone, there are also Suboxone, which is a medication assisted treatment. Then there's also like an injection that some participant gets, which is called Sublocade. So there are different types of medications that assist people with opiate use disorder. Sorry for using the acronym. And so in supporting our participants, a lot of times our participants would need to go into the hospital. They would have different medical issues, sometimes wounds, or sometimes just different medical issues that would require them to be admitted into the hospital. And because a lot of the hospitals don't operate on a harm reduction basis, our participants would not be given certain like pain meds, or they wouldn't be kept comfortable. They wouldn't be given any kind of like medication assisted treatment that would like make them feel more comfortable. A lot of our participants, once they go into the hospital, they go through like withdrawal symptoms where they're very, very uncomfortable, sweating, just really, really, really uncomfortable. And because of the way the hospitals are set up and don't operate from a harm reduction, standpoint, then a lot of our participants kind of suffer when they go seek care, just because, they're not receiving the care that they need. Maybe the medical providers don't understand, MAT or harm reduction. And this is what I've seen working with our participants.
Yeah, and so a frequent thing that happens is that the folks go to receive medical care and then leave against medical advice, right? And they're sort of kind of treated as like oh, well, you must not want this care that I have to offer. So, okay, fine, go back to your life. You know, the drugs must be more important. And it's a more complicated and nuanced story than that, right? It's very uncomfortable for them to be in an overnight stay, for example, especially without any kind of medication assisted treatment. And so our folks will say, I have to go get well. That will be the terminology that they would use, right? I have to go get well because I'm in withdrawal. I'm in pain. It's very uncomfortable. And as a result, they end up not getting the medical care. They get treated poorly while they're there, because it's known that the reason that they can't stay is that they have to continue to use their drugs, right? To fend off withdrawal. And so it's kind of this nasty little cycle that plays out. And I'll kind of tag in here and say, I think it was D who chimed in. If you don't know how they be, whether they behave a certain way, how can they be stigmatized? And I think my response there was like, there's a lot of visual indicators of lifestyle. It's pretty obvious when a person is unsheltered, their hygiene is going to suffer. They may have many of their belongings or all of their belongings with them. And so it's pretty obvious what's happening in their life, or seemingly obvious. And so they're treated a certain way based on sort of the visual indicators or like these sensory indicators that we have, even really without knowing a person's story. And I think part of the way this stigma operates is that it doesn't allow us to dig deeper and know the story. I can't get to know somebody if the only way I'm knowing them through my only lens is the stigma that I'm viewing them through, right? Oh, you're unsheltered. I must know what your story is. I must know the problems that you're facing. I'm not going to really dig deeper. I'm going to treat you the way that I treat everybody who's unsheltered or using drugs, right? Yeah, Wes and Shelley mentioned this concept of signaling. Our behavior, our visual indicators, our signals, absolutely. Wes and Shelley, there are some hospital systems which are taking a more harm reduction oriented approach. I think there is one hospital in our area, it's the Jefferson Health System, that they're opening something called a bridge clinic, right? And so it's this way of bridging people between the emergency department and aftercare, right? And so if you come in to see me on an emergency basis, I know that you're not going to be able to stay overnight, but I can kind of connect you to this bridge clinic who does have medication assisted treatment available. It's all drop in. You don't need appointments, which is going to be difficult for our folks to meet and maintain. And then they get connected to the aftercare in an ongoing way. I think that's still relatively uncommon from my perspective. Is that your perspective too, Renee? Go ahead.
Well, I will say that now here in Philly, in mostly all of the emergency rooms, they are using certified recovery specialists and certified health workers in the emergency room. So when individuals come in and they are substance users, they are connected with a certified recovery specialist, a certified peer specialist, a community health worker who they talk to, and the worker can then advocate for the individual to receive like MAT, whatever would make that person feel more comfortable and stay to receive the care that they need. They have this worker there who advocates for them. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, every hospital here in Philly now uses CRSs and certified recovery specialists and community health workers to advocate and work with our participants in a more harm reduction approach. I don't know if like the hospital is adopting a harm reduction approach, but I do think they're moving in the right direction with trying to accommodate our participants, individuals who are using substances and are needing medical care. Okay, so while we're still talking about stigma, let's talk about like this cycle of stigma. And one thing that is very important to point out when we're talking about stigma is what we believe about people, what we believe about a person. It has a direct impact on how that person is able to navigate the world. So since we're talking about substance use, and we know that substance use is stigmatized, there is definite stigma around substance use. Let's look at this cycle. So at the top, it says stigma. We'll say people who use drugs. People who use drugs, they are stigmatized. And because they're stigmatized, they have these stereotypes placed on them, these stereotypes and these labels. And some of them, a few of the labels are people who use drugs, they're criminals. People who use drugs are lazy. They don't want to work. And because of these labels, these stereotypes, they're expected to behave a certain kind of way. So there are these roles placed on them, these expectations. And the expectations are that people who use drugs, they steal. People who use drugs are not dependable. And because of these roles, these expectations, they are provided limited opportunities. So we know that people who use drugs, it's very hard for them to find a job. Sometimes it's hard for them to find housing. And when they're told no over and over again, and they're treated badly over and over again because they use drugs, these feelings become internalized, and they begin to reinforce these feelings. And then they go use more drugs because they're stigmatized, and then the stigma continues, and it's a vicious cycle that goes on and on and on. When it comes to harm reduction and how we understand that substance use is stigmatized, we also have to understand that stigma also promotes abstinence-only ideas. So some people often feel like they have failed, like they can't succeed if they can't stay clean or sober for extended periods of time. So like understanding that they're like that stigma also promotes abstinent only ideas. It tells a lot of our individuals, a lot of the residents that you'll be working with, that they can't succeed and that they constantly keep failing.
Yeah, people sort of take on this identity. I think at least the folks that we work with, many folks take on this identity of I am a failure, period, right? Like that's who I am. I failed all along the way, and I might continue to use drugs because of how badly that feels. That does not feel good at all. But here's the thing that does make me feel good, right? At least for a little while. And so you can see that the way this thing cycles and spins pretty out of control. Just kind of like I did a thing. I don't necessarily feel good about that thing. I was treated poorly because of that thing. And it's hard to escape this cycle because the only way I can feel good enough to kind of move through my day is to kind of fight against that, right? Like is to sort of like keep using, keep numbing, keep distancing, keep distracting. Yeah. Looks like folks are in the chat. I won't read all this out loud, but I think folks are kind of really interested in this process of like using people with lived experience to help navigate the health system. And so there's a lot of good stuff going on back and forth about the health system. Very cool. I like it. Let me ask you some questions here. This question on the screen, and I want you to feel free to unmute and shout out. It's a broad question because it asks about risky behavior. We can also think about drug use in particular. Why do people use drugs? Why might somebody use a substance of any kind? What are some of the reasons that we know of? The thrill of it. Absolutely. It's exciting to get high, to escape. And I like that Meg goes even deeper there. Not just physical pain, but mental pain, right? Perhaps you're familiar with this kind of pipeline of a person who suffers an injury, then gets a pain relief medication, an opioid usually. They become addicted. It becomes much easier to attain those drugs on the street, cheaper. And then now we're in a whole different ball game, right? So that physical pain pipeline, the mental pain also that people are trying to deal with to mask it. Marianne mentions relief. Yeah, and relief maybe broadly, both physical, mental, emotional. Jeffrey mentioned this idea of peer pressure. And it's why we're so concerned with like young people, right? Because we believe that as people's frontal lobe, our lobes are developing, people are beginning to develop their judgment in young adulthood or teenagehood. They're perhaps maybe more susceptible to peer pressure. And so, yeah, they're fitting into their peer group. Everybody's doing it. Why not? To belong. Other people in their life do so. I like that because not only peers, but when I think about, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, there was a really big study done asking people about childhood trauma that they had experienced. It's called the ACE study. And what we found is that when people experienced 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, these traumas, such as having a family member incarcerated, or domestic violence in the home, or having a person in the home who is a substance user. These things were like these little traumas that when you had several of these traumas stacked up, it led to significant health and wellness outcomes later in life for people. Right. So I think this idea of other people in their life are using drugs. And so of course you're using drugs. That's what you see. That's what you know. That's sort of a coping skill. And so that makes a lot of sense. To stay up and study. Oh, I love that one. That's a great example. Yeah, maybe start with like a little extra Ritalin, and it progresses from there. Adrenaline rush. Yeah. Oh, Robbie mentions that maybe they don't see it as risky. That's interesting. I certainly, like, in my family, when I was a young person, I would have viewed drugs as like a risky thing. But I'm imagining, I think this is where your head is at, that like perhaps other people are using drugs, or they're using a certain amount or certain type of drugs that they just don't think of it as risk. It's just like part of life, right? I even think about cigarette smoking. And I know that in our country we are starting to have some different ideas about cigarette smoking. I would even say it's like much more stigmatized now to be a smoker. You know, if somebody like were to light up a cigarette in a restaurant right now, you'd be like, what is happening? Like, that's just like not the way we live anymore. But it wasn't seen as so risky, 20, 30 years ago, right? Loneliness, that's a great one. Genetics. Curious about your ideas there on genetics, about why somebody might engage in risky behavior, Susan. Feel free to keep chiming in. Experimentation. Yes. Um, Spiritual awareness or awakening. Yeah, maybe this is a bit of a trope, but I'm thinking of people that use psychedelics, or like they go on these peyote trips or things like that. Yeah, it's a good example of that. Mark, you're kind of like hitting real life here a little bit, right? Not just those other people who use drugs to pair with their dinner, right? Anybody ever have a glass of wine with dinner? Um, to have a different feeling during sex, to become awakened, right? These are kind of human impulses. And I think we find different ways to meet some of these impulses, and some of those ways are drugs for people, or alcohol. Um, yeah, Cynthia, thanks for linking some of the ACE study information. Appreciate that. And then to feel more creative. Okay, let me put up my list of stuff. You've really hit on a lot of it. To relax and unwind, people use drugs. They do it in social settings. They do it as part of family traditions or spiritual rituals. Anybody ever have a glass of champagne at a wedding? Because it's fun and pleasurable. To deal with emotional or physical pain, you all touched on that really heavily. I love it. To disconnect, right? Just need a break for a little bit from whatever my life is presenting right now. To make difficult circumstances more tolerable, or to cope. Yeah, I can keep doing this. I can keep working the late shift, the graveyard shift at work, but I might need a little something to help me get through, right? Like that kind of idea. So I want to present to you this metaphor. I talked with John about this already a little bit, but as providers on our end, and as people in a community who are going to have people living on church property there, I think some of the stuff that people could engage in, we can sort of see this as the tip of an iceberg, right? This thing that you're doing, maybe it's drug use, maybe it's choosing not to engage in medical or mental health care, maybe it's sex work. These things are like pretty obvious and somewhat scary, I think, to us, especially if it's outside of our typical frame of reference. And I think as a distinction from non-harm reduction based practice, a program may choose to really focus on that high risk behavior. It's obviously unsafe. I want to make sure that you're making good choices for yourself so that you can be independent, so that you can live your life in the way that you want to. That high risk behavior is very visible and easy to identify for us, right? And I think what I would encourage us to do when we're looking through a harm reduction lens is to focus less on, oh, sorry, I just wanted to mute because there's a fire truck going by. Focus a little bit less on that intense and scary behavior. There we go, Philadelphia saying hi. and maybe start to explore what's beneath that. What's happening, right? Why is somebody choosing to engage in a high risk behavior? And I think often that reason is survival, mental, emotional coping, often literal survival. People that have experienced chronic homelessness can feel unsafe to be unsheltered overnight. Maybe I need to take something to keep myself awake overnight so I don't get my stuff stolen, so that I'm not harmed in some other significant way, right? So that I can be aware when they do encampment sweeps, which is happening more and more across the country, right? And so if we can view that high risk behavior as a survival skill, a survival tool, then the next question that we have to ask is, what might that person be trying to survive? And I think this is a much more practical and caring way to direct our energy when we're dealing with somebody who is engaging in high risk behavior than trying to focus on kind of keeping them in the lines, right? Ooh, the thing you're doing is really scary and high risk. Don't do that. I think we can expend our energy in much more practical and relevant ways. What's going on for you? What's the story behind the story, right? And I think when we're doing that work, we're focused in a much more relational way that's going to have a much greater impact on the person who's sitting across from us, right? I know that you're not social service providers, but you are perhaps going to come in contact with people with a story, right? And so I think if we focus so much on the obvious part of the judgment that can come around the high risk behavior, if we can focus more on, wait a minute, there's a survival happening here. There's a reason why this is happening. And it's maybe more valuable to know that reason than any other thing that you can do. We talked about the cycle of stigma already. Folks who are drug users or folks who engage in high risk behavior are sometimes only seen as that high risk behavior, the tip of the iceberg. That's all people see when they look at them, right? And it is not frequent that people are looked at as people, right? Still with thoughts and hopes and dreams, maybe clouded, maybe a little bit further back on their journey than some others, but still people who are seeking meaning in life, right? And it's that story that's worth expending our energy toward. That's going to be where the healing moments are for the folks that we're engaged with. Let me pause there. I know we've been kind of talking at you for a little while. What questions, comments, or thoughts are coming up for folks? I want to just check in with you, make sure you're still awake, make sure you're with us and following where we're at.
I'm not a good typer, so I'm just gonna talk. Hi, I'm Shelley.
Hit it. Hi.
I'm a school teacher and I've seen, I've had parents who were drug users. And so I think sometimes we need to also respect and see them as parents who love their children. Maybe they're sex workers, maybe they're addicted to drugs, maybe they're homeless, but I taught at a school for homeless children, and we tried to develop a relationship with the parent as the parent and try to get past the maybe the stigma of whatever was going on in their lives, but to respect their person as a parent. And so anyway, I think there are a lot of people that have these stigmas, but yet there are also a lot of other things as well. So I think parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters, and so I think that's really important to recognize that as well.
Yeah, thanks for kind of really putting a nice fine point on that, which is that sometimes people who are experiencing stigma are sort of flattened. They're not permitted to be whole people, right? Three-dimensional people with like thoughts and hopes and dreams and relationships, just like we have relationships, grandbabies that they care about, maybe less resources to kind of demonstrate that care through in a kind of commercial sense, but doesn't mean it's not there, right? So yeah, you're really hitting, I think we're on the same page with that. And further, I think when we do that flattening, when we're engaging in stigma, and what we're doing there is we're pushing people away, right? A person who people are very smart. People who are drug users are very astute about the nature of the relationships that they're in, right? And so um, when they're treated as a one-dimensional person who's only a drug user, they do not want to have anything to do with that person, right? All I know is I'm back in that cycle of stigma, and I'm not going to be treated well, and I need to get the heck out of here. I don't want to be any part of that, right? So the what's beneath the surface here is where we can expend our energy. Thanks for sharing that, Shelley. All right. Let me take a peek at my slides. I think this is a good pause. Let's take 5 minutes, like stretch your legs, get some water. I got 7 minutes past the hour, so let's come back at 12 minutes past the hour, and we'll dive back in and keep exploring. Okay, so we just kind of explored this metaphor of the iceberg and the way that we engage with people as whole people, right? With a story beneath the surface. The piece that I want to talk about now is how frequently that story is a story of trauma. Certainly people engage in risky behaviors, as we noted already, because it's fun and because it feels good and because our friends are doing it, right? But sort of far and away, the experience of the people that we serve at Pathways, at least, is a story of trauma, right? There is pain and hurt there. So I want to kind of offer a tiny, the tiniest definition you've ever seen of trauma. This is sometimes how we talk about it in the training space. A traumatic event is one in which a person feels terrified and helpless. In other words, a person experiences a loss of safety and a loss of control. And so when people experience that trauma, they're looking for something to regain a sense of control, regain a sense of safety, and to not feel the feelings of that trauma, right? Or see the memories of it in their mind's eye, right? And so there is a well-documented in the health literature relationship between when people experience trauma, they then do subsequent health risk behaviors, right? It's not always drugs, but health risk behaviors are elevated when people experience trauma. And of course, one of those risks is going to be drug use, right? Here's the point that I want to make here. And it kind of goes back to that metaphor, that iceberg. If we can truly understand a risky behavior that's in front of us, right? Person engaging in a risky behavior, we're interacting with them. If we can understand that through this lens as a response to trauma, I think what that allows us to do is to sort of be much more patient and compassionate with that person, right? Because they experience that loss of safety, that loss of control, often through no fault of their own, right? That trauma. And they're responding the way humans respond to trauma. And so I think for me, at least, that gives me some breathing room, right? I don't have to focus so much on the risk behavior. I understand that it is an adaptive response to what's happening in their lives. And let me just like slow down and be patient with this person. I do feel a sense of urgency around like if I have a strategy to help reduce harm, I do sometimes feel an urgency to say, wait a minute, remember, don't use alone. You're at much more risk of overdose, right? But there's a different heightened level of compassion, I think, there for the person and what they're experiencing, what they must be experiencing, and all of that pain that they must be covering up. I think the other thing that's true is that when people and Renee, I wonder if I want to kind of cue you up to talk about this a little bit, but the other part of this and why we know that this connection between risk and trauma is true is that when people move towards sobriety or abstinence, that can be a very difficult time for people, right? Because no longer am I covering up am I disconnecting from that trauma? Now it's here, it's raw. I wonder if you have any thoughts there you share, Renee, about what that's like for people and how they cope.
Yeah, it's just so funny, ironic because over the weekend I had a conversation with an old colleague, and we were talking about that very thing of when you first enter into recovery, there's all these feelings and emotions and things that you just, and like, you know, things that you just never, I'm not going to say never, but haven't dealt with in a very long time. Feelings of like past traumas that we were self-medicating to get away from. Now they are resurfaced. And you know, we were talking about like some strategies and some practices that we personally had placed in our lives in order to get through that, because it's very difficult. It's a very new feeling. It's very scary. And I will say that when people are going through that, that's the point where they really need support, really need people to talk to when these new feelings of past traumas and emotions and just things that, you know, we were trying to get away from when we were using drugs, and now we're in recovery and we're having to deal with these things. So I was just having a conversation, and I will say to end, the one thing that me and my colleague had in common, the one thing that we like, the one practice was definitely support, talking to people about the behaviors and the emotions, but also incorporating like hobbies and healthy activities to kind of like distract you or distract your, you know, your mind from these negative feelings and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, some good stuff popping off in the chat. Also, Renee, thanks for sharing those thoughts. Um, it looks like it's maybe just Shelley. Is it Wes and Shelley? Maybe just Shelley. Oh, there's Wes. Okay. Getting sober may need leaving a group and having to form new connections. And I was getting ready to type this, but I'll just say it out loud. That yes, and I think that comes with all sorts of risk as well, right? In terms of social isolation. I think one of the things that you might expect to see when people first become housed in your new community are that they live somewhat strangely. What I mean by that is sometimes we'll move new people into our apartments, maybe folks that have been on the streets for 5 years, 10 years, even, right? Some folks that have really been out there, and they won't lay in the bed. They will lay on the floor in the middle of their living room because they haven't laid in a bed in that many years, right? And so there is a component of like social isolation and discomfort with this new way of life that I think for people who live in beds every night, that's like, of course you want to sleep in a bed, right? You know, of course I want to have a little quiet time in my apartment at night, you know, maybe watch the TV or something. That's an unusual experience for some of the folks that are going to be living in your community, I think. And and I think we can view that in this relationship between risk and trauma too. And I think it is an inherently risky time when people become housed. They're lost sometimes, right? And especially they're trying to figure out what are the right choices for me. So yeah, just thinking about that. I also wanted to bring up a comment, and I heard Pastor John talk about this also. This was privately chatted to me, but I can't get over the fact that Christians are twice as likely than the general public to blame those experiencing homelessness for their situation, rather than extending care and empathy, or understanding the trauma, right? I think that's not that unusual. I also have read a study that says that people who are mental health care providers are much more likely to be stigmatizing towards people in their care than the general public also. So I think there is this relationship of like close proximity to what's happening. I think there's an element of burnout there and vicarious trauma that people are experiencing that makes it sort of very difficult to tap into a compassionate, patient way of being with people and understanding the story. And I think the more times you've seen somebody come through your door that's experienced a similar set of circumstances, the more we think we know the story before it's told to us, right? So you're not going to be able to sort of like escape from this idea of stigma just by who you are as a person, right? It's a practice that we have to engage in this empathy, and it has to be kind of renewed over and over again with people. A lot of stuff popping up in the chat. I love how engaged you all are. Thank you so much. Yeah, it sounds like it can be an identity crisis. The move-in process I think you're referring to, absolutely. I think the getting sober process can be an identity crisis too. Who am I without my pills? Who am I without my bottle? And I'll say, I guess we haven't really said this much. Our discussion right now is one around where, okay, people are eventually going to get sober and like live their lives in the way that we think they should. We have folks at Pathways. I'm thinking of one man who sits outside with his breathing tubes and his tall boy, and he still drinks every day. And so that's part and parcel of a harm reduction oriented housing first program too, is that sometimes the risk behavior doesn't go away at all, ever. But we would hope that it can be sort of moderated to the extent that a person feels like they're in control of their lives. Certainly that they have a roof over their heads, they're able to maintain their tenancy, which sometimes the substance use can put their tenancy at risk if they're not careful. And I'll also say housing itself is a harm reduction, right? If you're going to drink as much as you're going to drink, it's going to be safer and healthier for you to do so with a roof over your head. And so from our perspective, that's progress. That's valuable, right? I would rather you be as safe and as healthy as possible if you're going to make the choices that you're making. Hopefully, we can talk about choices that are healthier for you. If you're not open to that, I want to sort of like play the long game. That's kind of where we're at. My last point on the slide says, and this is the idea that let's say that we only focused on the tip of the iceberg, right? The high risk behavior. We don't get down deep into the story. We don't help people understand their trauma, explore it, feel it, cope with it. Unaddressed trauma is going to increase the risk of mental health problems and substance use disorders, right? And so it makes sense to explore this. Now, that's not what your role is in the folks' lives on your community, right? You're not trauma therapists. But I think this idea of tapping into relationship and story and understanding is a place that seems right from my perspective. So just a thought there. All right, let me pass the mic to Renee.
Thanks, Ryan. Now, like we talked about stigma, we talked about trauma, and with that, with trauma, with stigma, there's shame. And then there's stress from the shame, from the trauma, from the stigma. And before I get into before I put the rest of the content on the slide, I just want to mention that this quote that we have on the slide by Miss Brene Brown, and I think she's a social worker. I know she wrote several self-help books. I have one, and they all are around shame and how to first understand that we all deal with shame, and then to like navigate it and how to like, get around, get better with dealing with shame. But she says that shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. And I think that is very important when we talk about shame and the stress that not only we, but the people that we serve go through. So shame is built into our culture. The people that we serve, they receive it in the homeless shelters. They receive shame on the streets before they get housed. They receive it with former behavioral health providers. Sometimes they receive shame with their families, and plenty other venues and other aspects and areas in their lives. And when our participants do things like or not our participants, or the people that you will have living in your housing, your residence, when the people that we are working with, when they do things like engage in risky behaviors, how does heaping more shame on them help? How does it help the situation? How does it help them There's no need to threaten like consequences during the midst of a crisis. So like here at Pathways, we don't threaten our participants with their housing, with losing their housing, when they engage in risky behaviors or when they are dealing with certain consequences from their actions. We don't threaten their housing. We don't threaten them with their housing. We like to say that they go through things called natural consequences. They go through the consequences that you and I would go through if we was to engage in some of the same activities and behaviors that they do. Our participants know when they've made a mistake. Your residents, they'll know. The people that we work with, they'll know when they made a mistake that could compromise their housing or their program participation. And we don't need to remind them of this in a shameful way. We can point out the discrepancies between their stated goals and our observed and the behaviors that we have observed. So reaffirm our commitment to support our job as the providers, as service providers, is not to shame our participants, the people that we work with, but we should be supporting them no matter what. When they walk through our doors, we are making a commitment to them, to help them. And most of them are accustomed to isolation, to being isolated. They are accustomed to a rotating cast of service providers who don't follow through. They're used to people abandoning them based on their symptoms or their disorders or the risky behaviors that they engaged in. And us as harm reductionists, us who we work through a harm reduction lens, we walk alongside our clients through their hospitalizations, through their incarcerations, even through their return to homelessness. We walk alongside them. And so stressful events are inevitable. Natural consequences are inevitable in the course of a long-term relationship. Our participants will relapse. Some of them will continue to use. Some of our participants will be incarcerated. Some of our participants or some of the people that you work with, they will get incarcerated. They will return to use. They will get in different situations. And we, as harm reductionists, the one thing that we always do is walk alongside them. Until the crisis gets resolved, until the person goes home, we always maintain a healthy therapeutic working relationship with our residents, our clients, our participants, and the bonus to that relationship is that we build a lot of trust and rapport along the way. And I will say that without the trust, without the rapport, without building a healthy therapeutic relationship with our participants, our residents, our clients, it is very hard to walk alongside them. It's very hard for them to allow us to walk alongside them as they go through this journey called life. Yeah. And so now we talked about the cycle of stigma. And now we will get into the cycle of shame. And I will say that in harm reduction, we do focus a lot on safety. But if we only focus on safety, then we're very unlikely to decrease the shame and stigma that our participants, our residents, the people that we work with, we're unlikely to decrease the shame and the stigma that they deal with. And when we reduce the shame and the stigma, it increases the safety and the connection for our, the people that we work with. So let's talk about this cycle of shame. So we have a resident who's living in your housing, and we could use the same scenario. They are, let's just say we have a person who is, they use drugs, and they are living in your housing. So because they use drugs, they feel shame. And because they feel shame, and if the shame could come from the drug use, the shame could come from the stigma, from being in a marginalized group. But let's just say they feel shame, and so they use substances. in order to like release that shame, release those emotions, release those feelings, this person engages in using cocaine, using drugs, in order to release those feelings. The more substances that they use, the more their behaviors is criticized, the more they feel shame, and the cycle is continued. So they feel shame for using drugs, and because they're stigmatized, because they're discriminated against and you know, just pushed to the limits of society, they want to release. And so they use substances. And then they do something risky, and then their behavior is criticized, and then they feel more shame. So it's just another vicious cycle that continues, that the people that we serve constantly go through on a daily basis. I see in the chat, before I move on to the next slide, I see that Robbie is asking, are we going to talk about violent behavior tonight? So far, we're talking as if everyone wants and accepts help. What about the person lashing out and putting other residents in danger? Okay, that's a good question. And I know that here at Pathways, we deal with participants, or we deal with residents who we house, who, you know, who are not as accepting to the help, who we, you know, we like to call, or not like to call, but we, you know, say they can be a little difficult. But because we are focusing on harm reduction, and because tonight we're talking about like the intro to harm reduction, I don't know if we're going to dig like into in really deep about like violent behaviors. But I will say that we just, you know, as a certified peer specialist, I have dealt with a lot of people in doing outreach in the community of Philadelphia, and you know, going out into the community, trying to build rapport and ask and offer housing. A lot of our participants, or a lot of people living on the streets, they don't want the housing. They don't trust us. They don't have a reason to trust us. They don't believe what we say. They don't want our housing. They don't want anything to do with us. And the one thing that we do is we give them their space. We respect their autonomy. We respect their decisions. We respect, you know, we respect them as a person. But we don't just, you know, one and done and just say, okay, they don't want housing. They don't want our help. They don't want our services. We're just going to leave them where they're at. No, we continue to go out. We continue to try to build a relationship, to try to build rapport. And in the hopes that the more we get to know this person, the more we get to, you know, learn them and learn some of their past traumas, learn them as a person, that they will begin to trust us, and we begin to build a relationship, and they will, you know, either accept housing or accept our services. But we don't leave them out there. We continue to offer the support and try to build the relationships with our participants. I know that was long-winded. I hope that helped. I'm so sorry. But I hope that helped. I'm sorry.
I wanted to just like add a little bit. So I will say, when I talk about harm reduction, or from my perspective of anything we've said today, I really am not referring to people who want and accept help, right? Anything that we've talked about today, we're putting into practice with folks who kind of, from the outside looking in, are not necessarily happy to be dealing with us, wanting to be dealing with us, right? And so I think this is why we're stressing so much this shame and stigma piece. I mean, I'm sure you've picked up on the fact that we really haven't talked about harm reduction strategies per se very much. And I think that's very intentional, right? Because you're not gonna get anywhere in trying to sort of like do services to people. What we're trying to do is walk alongside people. And so the pathway to do that is by reducing shame and stigma, right? When we're doing that, people are willing to accept help much more frequently than when we're not doing that. I want to give kind of an example. I know we're focused a lot on drug use. It is kind of one of the key risk behaviors in a housing first type program. So that's why we're focusing so much on it. But in the United States, people with opioid use disorder, people who are using opiates, around 20% of those folks overall are going to kind of head in the direction of a treatment program. in our program, within 6 months, around 60% of our OUD population, our opioid use disorder population, are engaging in treatment on their own. We don't have any requirements for it. It's not a thing we're making people do. We're not putting their housing at risk for it. They're doing it on their own. And I think it's because of this process of engagement with the relational pieces here. So that's, I think, part one here of your question. The other part is people who are lashing out and putting other residents in danger. I don't, I guess I want to kind of ask a follow-up question to you, Robbie, but do you perceive that people who, is this a person who uses drugs, or is this a person with mental health challenges? Anybody? Yeah, I see.
Yeah, I
Go ahead.
mean, you know, I'm just saying that, you know, we have children around here, and
Yeah.
what I was hearing from you guys is, you know, we stick with them, and that's awesome. I mean, you know, I'm not opposed to that, except I'm not hearing it, you know, it sounds like we're talking about uh not necessarily dangerous behaviors on the part of the people who are
Mhm.
traumatized. And I mean, we have to all recognize that if you're traumatized and you're using drugs, you may act out. And, you know, and I'm not saying people don't deserve another chance, but we just, you know, we have to, I haven't heard anybody talk about, except for John
Mhm.
saying, you know, we will have some protocols now, but, you know,
Yep.
that's just something we have to keep in our mind, is that we have pretty old people and children here
Mhm.
on this campus of our church, and we have to recognize there could be some lashing out and some behavior that could be dangerous to others.
Yeah, I hear you, and I hear the concern about people who are vulnerable on your campus, the children, older folks, and stuff. I think from my perspective, as a person who's been providing care to people with mental health and substance use challenges for a number of years now, I don't find that these folks are more likely to be dangerous or violent. I think it certainly is a bit of stigma that people with mental health challenges in particular are recipients of. In fact, people with mental health challenges are more likely to be victims of violent crime than perpetrate them. And so I think if we start from that perspective, right, and trying to kind of challenge our own ideas there, I think it is fair to put a protocol in place for when a person becomes violent. Certainly in my community that I live in, I want to know who are my neighbors that I can count on if somebody else is coming through the neighborhood or lives in the neighborhood and becomes violent, right? I want to have my own sort of personal protocols there, ideas about what I'm going to do. And so I think it's not much different in this circumstance, right? Certainly, you're going to have roof above workers providing care and as a crisis intervention point.
And of course, we don't want other residents, you know, being in
Yep.
danger from each other. So, I mean,
Yep.
that I just, you know,
Yeah,
I,
and here's what I'll say about that. It's a good point. Harm reduction is really about how I can do whatever I want with my body, right? This is the idea. I'm saying this. I'm stating this actually. Bodily autonomy is huge, but when I start to infringe on other people, that's a problem, right? That can't happen in our communities either here at Pathways, right? But that's similar. That's similar anywhere, right? In your home community where you live, people can't just like lash out and be violent. People will get the cops called on them. I think it's not that dissimilar. Um, I think it was West who typed that. That's how rights work. Yeah. Uh, I guess that's a two-part thing. I want to kind of distill this. I want to be clear if I can. I want us to challenge stigma that the folks that you're serving or that are going to be living on your campus are like inherently more prone to violence, right? I don't think it's true. But also, you should be prepared because people are violent to some degree in the world, right? And so I think that's part of it too. Um, we have protocols in place at Pathways that we keep ourselves safe, our workers safe. Yes. And I want to give people space to be people too, right? So I know that's like it's a both and type of answer. Yeah, I'll stop there and keep us moving. Anything you wanted to add here on this slide, Renee?
No, I think that was it.
Okay.
Mhm. Okay, and then before we move on and get into like harm reduction and the practices and some strategies, these are just 3 takeaways from our previous section on unpacking assumptions. The first one says drugs don't always cause harm, and Ryan talked about how doctors and teachers and our family members and people use substances, and people use substances for various reasons, and sometimes it's to have a good time, sometimes it's to release stress, and we need to keep in mind, I think that like when we're working under through a harm reduction lens, a very important key takeaway is to understand that drugs don't always cause harm. And just to piggyback off of, what Ryan was saying in the previous slide, people who use drugs, don't cause harm or aren't necessarily more violent than anybody else. So just one of the key takeaways. Another key takeaway is that abstinence is one of many possible goals. There are even like here at Pathways, where we solely operate under a harm reduction, lens, but we have a big percentage of participants who, once they get housed and have some case management services wrapped around them, and they have some stability and some time to breathe, they do make the decision to seek recovery and try abstinence. So very important to understand that abstinence is one of many possible goals. But yes, people, when, working in a housing first model, I do believe that a lot of people choose to change their lives for the better once they receive housing and some services to make their lives a little better. And then the third key takeaway is that drugs can meet important needs for people. Drugs can, like we were just saying, people use drugs to relieve stress. They take away drugs just to, have a good time. So people use drugs for different reasons, and drugs can meet important needs for people. So those are the 3 key takeaways that we want to take with us in regards to our previous section. Pass it over to you, Ryan.
Thank you. All right. Want to talk finally about harm reduction. We've done a lot of dancing around stigma and shame and relationship and trauma. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what is harm reduction. And here's that definition that I think folks are looking for is coming up in this section. Firstly, I want to start with a tiny, tiny, tiny slide on the history of harm reduction. Here's an example of maybe something that I might maybe call mutual aid, but I think serves as a bit of the root of some of what we know of as harm reduction today. If you're familiar with the Black Panther Party's Free Breakfast for Children program and some of the health clinics that they started in the 60s and 70s, this is an example of a community who saw a gap and saw a need and supported sort of their own community, right? To have better health outcomes, to be well, to live happier lives. We know that like these days, free lunches and school programs are kind of founded on this same idea. Like that is today's programs are an outgrowth of some of what the Panthers did back then. The Young Lords is a group that did end up working closely with the Panthers, but Puerto Rican folks mostly in the Bronx. I think there's an incredible documentary. I'm going to type the title of it in the chat. You can find this on YouTube. It's called Takeover, about the Young Lords and the way that they literally took over the Lincoln Hospital because it was underfunded and people were receiving such poor care there that they held the hospital itself hostage to sort of demonstrate to the city that like what was going on was not right. As an outgrowth of that, they developed an acupuncture program for heroin users, right? Helping people detox from heroin using acupuncture only. And they were, I think, over like on a rolling 10-day period, they were helping like 600 folks detox every 10 days, which is so wild. These are not trained medical professionals. These are people who saw a need, a lack of care, and they were digging in and trying to help their community, right? The reproductive rights and women's health movements, I think, are rooted in kind of the 70s feminist activism around bodily autonomy, around abortion rights, things like this. I think is the same story that we're telling, right? It's the same response to lack of care. It's taking it by the reins and trying to figure out how to help people kind of live the lives that they want to live. And then finally, somewhat more recently, the activism is in response to the AIDS crisis. And I think this is where a lot of I've mentioned the word syringe exchange quite a bit already. I think syringe exchange as we know it today really started here. And so the big point that I want to get across here is that harm reduction is not from social workers. Social workers didn't invent it. Professionals didn't invent it. It's not an intervention for any other reason except we looked at what was happening in communities and said, wow, what a great idea. Wow, people don't need to suffer in some of these ways. What if we just help people who are making the choices that they're making anyway have healthier choices available to them, right? And so harm reduction really has been a response to a lack of care, a lack of resources, sometimes government inaction by marginalized folks for marginalized folks since at least the 60s. And I bet we could put a bunch more stuff on this slide earlier. Yeah, thanks, Wes and Shelley, for putting the link to that Takeover documentary. This documentary blew my mind. If you have 38 minutes, I just thought it was so cool. Here's some definitions that we've been looking for a little bit, right? Two definitions. We like to do this thing where we talk about the kind of big H, big R, h, little r. And so the definition on the left, you're going to find this on the National Harm Reduction Coalition's website. It says that harm reduction is a movement for social justice built on a belief in and respect for the rights of people who use drugs. In other words, just because a person uses drugs or engages in some risky behavior, let's say, they don't sort of lose their rights and all of the dignity that goes with that, right? The autonomy that goes with that, the ability to direct my own life. On the right-hand side, we see this definition here, a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the negative consequences associated with drug use. Yes, there is some harm that comes a person's way when they engage in risky behavior. Harm reduction is making the effort to reduce some of those negative consequences. If I can't change your mind about the decision you're making, and maybe it's not even worth it for me in this moment to do that, to spend my energy doing that, at least I can help you not face such intense consequences up to and including death, right? Largely, I think I would say that what we've talked about so far fits in the left side. Talking about the rights of people, the dignity that people deserve who are in our care as human beings, right? On the right is the much more practical stuff like syringe exchange. There are over 200 syringe exchanges operating in the US, probably much more than that by now. And so what we're doing when we engage in the beliefs and practices of harm reduction is we're supporting people in using their own self-identified survival tools, right? We're meeting people where they are. Is that a familiar phrase to anybody? It's such a common trope in like social services to say, meet people where they're at, right? Which is a person has a set of lived experiences, ways that they make decisions, survival skills that they have, and we meet them on where they're at, right? It's not about us sort of authoritatively telling people how to live, but it's sort of meeting people where they are living, right? Harm reduction also prioritizes health and wellness options for everybody at all times. Is there some healthier way that we can be doing this thing that you're doing? Cool, let's figure out what that is. And then we're acknowledging and refusing to perpetuate stigma and these cultural norms that have sometimes led people to be isolated, alone, and ashamed. All right, let me pass the mic.
Okay, so let's do a little reflection on ourselves. Let's think about ourselves. And I'll throw this question out there. Feel free to use the chat. But the question is asking what risky activities are a part of your life. So we all engaged in risky behaviors. So I'm asking everyone to, or if you want to share, if you feel comfortable sharing, use the chat to just put some risky activities or a part of your life. I will say for me, let's see, what is this, April? So I think I have 3 months under my belt. I was doing a very risky behavior. I was smoking cigarettes. I had recently quit, but that is a risky behavior that I was making the decision on engaging in for a very, very long time. And I am so glad to say that I have quit 3 months ago. So what are some other risky behaviors that we, as human beings, engaged in? I see Cynthia says riding her bike on city streets. Yes. And can I ask, do you wear a helmet? Do you wear a helmet when you ride your bike on city streets?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I had to switch over to my iPad. Yeah, no, absolutely. I wear a helmet. I do the best I can to be safe, but I also know it's not always a safe thing to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Cynthia. Yes, I was just curious to know. Riding a bike on city streets is definitely a risky behavior. And I know Ryan can attest to that because Ryan is a avid bike rider as well. I see driving, I see overeating, decades of sitting all day in an office environment. Ellie says, okay, drinking alcohol, overeating. I see Rita says pickleball. Oh, you fell and badly injured your wrist. I'm so sorry. I hope your wrist feels better. But yes, even engaging in sports is a risky behavior. Not exercising enough. I see Julie says texting while walking. I was in a car, I was driving today, and I was in shock of how the person behind me just had their phone up, like just had it up and was just like texting while driving. And I'm like, oh, that's really risky. So yes, all of those are great answers, and they are risky behaviors that we engage in as just human beings. Driving a car, eating alone, being emotionally vulnerable is a risky behavior, getting out of bed. So with all of these risky behaviors, what are some ways that we reduce harm related to these activities? So what are some ways that we reduce harm? I know for Cynthia, she said that riding her bike is a risky behavior. Riding her bike in the city streets is a risky behavior, but she reduces that harm by wearing a helmet. So what are some other ways that we can reduce our harm related to the activities that we listed? How can we reduce the harm of playing pickleball or engaging in sports? How can we reduce the risk? Let's see. Stop at 1 to 2 glasses of wine. Absolutely. Find safer sports. Or how about like finding pads, knee pads or elbow pads or something like that? I don't know if that's like not nice to wear in pickleball. Stretch first. Yep. Drink at home. Absolutely. Yep. And then how do we weigh these risks? How do we decide what to do, what to act or not act upon? So how do we weigh these risks? And are there judgments associated with our choices? So I know for me, like Ryan was saying earlier, the stigma around smoking cigarettes was a huge part of my decision. I mean, there was the health aspect and knowing that I was, putting toxins in my body, but I'm not going to sugarcoat the stigma itself was enough for me to be like, you know what, I'm so tired of being the outlier. I'm tired of people looking at me, smelling a certain kind of way. So there were definitely judgments associated with my choice to give up cigarettes. So Cynthia says, we decide if the risk is worth the pleasure. Absolutely. Rita says, it's the enjoyment versus the pain. Yes. And so I will say that as humans, we all engage in risky or unhealthy behaviors from time to time, like speeding or eating fast food. But there are steps we can take to lessen the risk associated with these behaviors, such as wearing a seatbelt, when we're driving or exercising regularly, but making sure we stretch first. Harm reduction as a concept is similar. Harm reduction, or it recognizes that people will make their own choices, even when others see these choices as bad or unhealthy. Harm reduction is not about ignoring or condemning risky behavior, but it's about acknowledging the risky behavior in a non-judgmental way, and then identifying practical ways of lessening the consequences these behaviors have on individuals. So yes. Thank you so much for engaging in those questions. I really appreciate it. And some things to think about, or what we already, like when playing a sport, we talked about stretching, using pads, we talked about like drink driving, the risk of like, drinking alcohol and then driving, and we should always have a designated driver. And then there are COVID precautions, like wearing a mask, which lessens the risk of not only COVID, but like the flu and other illnesses. And then we can even think about relationships, and how we are putting ourselves at risk when we get into relationships, how we are being vulnerable and putting ourselves at risk for heartbreak and things of that nature. And the way I think about like navigating that is being aware of things like red flags, and just like getting to know the people who we engage with. So, we all use harm reduction. We talked about wearing a helmet while playing sports, but we know that wearing a helmet, it won't prevent all head injuries in the sport of football. But wearing a helmet is the necessary tool to keep players as safe as possible when they are on the field. So for those people who are using drugs, harm reduction can mean equipping individuals with supplies like syringes, which are necessary to make their substance use safer. And we can't ensure that people won't overdose, or that their drugs won't be cut with dangerous or additives. But we can provide sterile syringes and other supplies that will lessen the risk of infection or contracting a chronic illness like HIV or hepatitis C and overdose. Harm reduction also entails having honest and direct conversations with individuals about their goals. And I talked about how like having these conversations is not always the most comfortable thing to do, but if we are trying to save lives and lessen risk, then it is very important to have those direct, honest conversations with the individuals that we are working with. And not everyone is interested in achieving total abstinence or pursuing recovery. But harm reductionists may help people to identify safer means of consumption, like snorting versus injecting, which is a form of harm reduction. And understanding that harm reduction honors the individual's self-determination, and it empowers them to make the choices that they feel are best for themselves. And we also we celebrate any small or incremental change that improves one's health and their safety. All right, pass it right back to you, Ryan.
Awesome, thanks. Let me go back to this slide. I want to just say one last thing here. The point of this is that like we're all doing harm reduction all the time. And I saw some great comments in the chat around like the risk versus reward piece. And I think how frequently I saw that come up where people are saying like, is this risk thing worth it? Are the rewards great enough? Makes me think about the participants that we serve, right? The folks who are living in our housing, they're making that risk assessment all the time too. And so I have to assume as whole 3D individuals that they're making that risk reward assessment and they're saying it's worth it right now. Am I always going to make that same choice? Maybe not. But today, in this moment, is worth it. Is it because I'm in, I have a chemical dependence and I need this, otherwise I'm going to feel withdrawal? Maybe. That plays a part of it for sure, but they're doing that risk reward just like we are, right? And so we're all doing harm reduction, and it shouldn't feel too out of the ordinary for somebody to receive a harm reduction a bit of advice, right? Hey, did you know that if you snorted, it actually lessens the risk of an abscess wound in your veins, right? It actually reduces risk of overdose a bit. No, you didn't know that? Great. I'm glad I could share. Let me know if there's anything else I can help you with, right? That's the kind of conversations that we're having. I know you're out there doing the thing that you're doing. I know you're out there eating your junk food, smoking your cigarettes, driving too fast. Anybody with a late night shopping addiction? I know you're out there doing that. Did you know that there are ways that you can put limits on your credit card? Right? That's a harm reduction strategy, right? And so those are the kind of conversations that we're having, asking if we can contribute some input. And when people say yes, we're going all in. I want to educate. It's about education, really. And it's from this perspective, knowing I'm doing stuff to keep myself safe. Don't you want tools to keep yourself safe? Here are a few, right? Risky behaviors are around us everywhere. We all do it. And I want to frame risk for a moment as like a really positive thing, actually, in that it helps us survive and thrive. It's a pretty natural part of being human. I think about like how risky we perceive teenagers to be, right? Teenagers are so risky doing stuff out there, being loud, getting in the way, whatever they're doing. I don't know. I haven't been a teenager in a while. I don't know what they do anymore. Risky stuff, I guess. And I think that's like a really kind of critical moment in their lives where they're like exploring the world around them through risk, right? So it's like really kind of like a appropriate developmental component there, to push the limits of experience, right? And here's, I'll just go ahead and put this quote up on the screen that I love so much. It says that if I'm denied the dignity of risk, this impedes my personal growth and impacts my quality of life. And so I think about this with folks who are doing risky behavior that's more stigmatized. Is my Dorito addiction very stigmatized? Not compared to like injection drug use, no. But if I didn't have the choice, if I didn't have autonomy and choice and self-determination to kind of keep digging into that Dorito bag, my quality of life would be lower than it is than having that choice, right? I see this idea in the chat of taking risks is how we learn. I also see it says Matthew 25 is risky. I don't know that reference, so I'd love to have more explanation if you can share it, Mark. And so because we can see, because it's possible to see risky behavior as useful, as sometimes necessary, at a minimum as a part of quality of life, then what harm reduction attempts to do is center that autonomy, center that choice and self-determination, and to say, I'm not here to take away your choices. I'm here to help you make as healthy and safe of choices as possible, right? Do I want for you to keep choosing this thing that is super, super risky? If I had to be honest, probably not. But I'm not going to get into a fight with you about that, right? That now we're not getting anywhere. You don't want anything to do with me. I love this idea. We heard this at a conference one time. If there's let's say that you work in an office building, right? And you notice that one of your colleagues steps out at once an hour for a cigarette break. And you pass them on your breaks and you say, hey, colleague, you know, cigarettes are really bad for you. Hey, colleague, did you know that elevated risk of cancer? Hey, colleague, this is not good for you. You should make a different choice. Guess what that colleague is going to avoid? They're not going to avoid cigarettes. They're going to avoid me, right? And so that perspective, I think, is really crucial for us as harm reductionists. I don't want this person avoiding me. I want to be with a foot in the door to be able to have a relationship with this person. And maybe we can talk about different choices down the line. But if everything I say to you is kind of a wag of the finger, you don't want anything to do with me, right? So just wanted to kind of reframe risk a little bit that way. Okay, this is a little bit dry, so I want to go through it somewhat quickly. But how do we know if a thing that we're doing is harm reduction? How do I know if one of the workers at Roof Above is doing harm reduction or not? I think the way that we know that will be if the intervention that they're engaging in are centered on these principles. So these are principles that apply to any risk behavior, not just drug use behavior. Harm reduction is focused on health and dignity, I want you to be as healthy as possible, but have the dignity to make the choices on your own, right? And the dignity of allowing that people do things for a reason, including people who are using drugs and have mental health challenges. And we talked about already, we know that sometimes that reason is as a response to trauma, right? So what we're doing when we tap into health and dignity is trying to understand the benefits and harms. Yes, the thing that you're doing has benefit to you. It also has harm. Let's talk about that openly. I don't want to shy away from that, right? Harm reduction is also participant centered. We call the clients that we work with participants, resident centered, we could say here, right? In other words, the therapeutic relationship is at the core, at the center of care. Everyone's got strengths. Everyone needs individualized strategies and approaches to kind of tap into what works for them. And so there's no one size fits all program of harm reduction. It's tailored to the person in front of us. Participant involvement is critical. People have to be able to make decisions, informed decisions about their lives, right? And so when we're providing care, when people are living in a permanent supportive housing unit, they should have involvement about the way that their days look and what's happening with the property, and what's going, if there's a person who is becoming violent, right? Kind of tapping back into Robbie's conversation, maybe there's room to have the community itself of residents talk about what they would do, how to handle it, right? Involving people in the process of care instead of doing care to them, right? And then ultimately, participant self-rule, letting people make choices on their own about their own lives, which I think is becoming more common, but has not always been common in like these care service provider relationships, right? The therapist is in charge, the psychiatrist is in charge, and they tell them what to do and what the care is going to look like. Recognizing inequalities and injustices is a critical part of harm reduction. I know that a person's identity is going to have a lot to do with how they're perceived engaging in their risky behavior. Think about this. If you pass somebody in the park who's sitting on a park bench eating a ton of junk food, they got their McDonald's wrappers everywhere, sauce is dripping down their face, right? But they're like so fit and buff, and you can tell they just got done with like a long 5-mile run, and they're like looking sharp. They're looking like well fit and exercised. Am I judging their fast food behavior as much as I'm judging a person who does not appear to be so fit, so well exercised, perhaps is overweight? No, that person is facing a great deal more stigma. And that is ultimately much more harmful. So people's identities and where they show up in the world and how they show up in the world is going to be key to the vulnerability that they have to risk, right? My identity itself plays a big part in how that risky behavior plays out in the world. Okay, I'm trying to go quickly because I recognize this is very like social worky. Harm reduction is also practical and realistic. Ryan sitting in front of you is never going to achieve perfect health behaviors. I'm not going to do all the things my doctor says, but I might do some of them, and that's worth celebrating, right? So what is practical for me as an individual and realistic? Can I put the Dorito bag down? No. But can I moderate a little bit? Maybe only one bag a week? Maybe I could do that. That's realistic for me. Okay, let's go with it, right? And then lastly, and this is core to the Housing First model, accountability without termination. And this goes back to Renee's comments around shame and stress, where we're not firing people from care simply because they haven't met their own goals around abstinence or around mental health challenges or whatever. We're continuing to try and help people understand the consequences of their own actions and behaviors and own the responsibility for their choices, but not firing them, not getting rid of them, right? Giving people chances. Are there times when folks end up like back on the street or in some other housing program as a result of what happened in a Housing First program? Yes, that does happen. But to the extent possible, we're wanting to avoid termination from services. All right. Whew. We're getting down. We're in our final hour, last 50 minutes here. Let's take another 5-minute break, stretch our legs. I can see folks are starting to get a little sleepy. It's 8:11 already. So let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back at 8:16. And we'll dive back in for our final push. I just wanted to take a quick moment to check in with people, see how we're doing, see what you need, see if there's any kind of percolating questions or thoughts. I think we can also, as we wrap up tonight, kind of return to some of the more salient ideas or questions that have come up so far. But just taking a moment, I'll give you a second if anybody has anything they want to chime in with. Feel free. All right. Renee, I'm
get my back.
gonna. Oh, I thought I heard somebody wanting to chime in. Renee, I'm gonna go ahead and kick it over to you and take us away.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so now that we learned about, or we talked about what harm reduction is. We talked about the difference between a harm reduction approach and a harm reduction model. Now let's talk about what harm reduction does. The first thing that I would like to emphasize is that harm reduction, it recognizes that people make their own choices based on their options and opinions of what feels right for them. So we talked about it a lot. We talked about how harm reductions allow people to have bodily autonomy. Harm reduction allows people to have self-determination. It allows people to have the ability to set their own goals that they want to work on and want to work on achieving. It recognizes that people have the expertise on themselves and that people have the ability to steer the car of their lives. Like they're in the driver's seats of their lives, and they make the decisions in regards to their lives. Another thing that harm reduction does do, it acknowledges that risky behaviors, it acknowledges risky behaviors in a non-judgmental manner. So it acknowledges that people are using substances or people are engaging in risky behaviors, but it acknowledges these behaviors in a non-judgmental way. We're not viewing them through stigma, or we're not throwing shade at people for engaging in these risky behaviors. We're acknowledging them, we're having conversations on how we can reduce the risk, and we're doing this in a non-judgmental manner. And then harm reduction, it identifies practical ways of lessening consequences of such behavior. I know that we touched a little bit about that, like how we have, and I know as a certified peer specialist, as well as a MAT care manager, I have had many conversations with the people that I have worked with around different practices and strategies of harm reduction, just such as maybe snorting a certain substance rather than injecting it, because it reduces the risk. As well as I know, like some participants I've had conversations with, if they were using an excessive amount of substances, maybe let's just say if a person was, using like 10 bundles of heroin a day, or fentanyl here in Philly, but let's say it were engaging in using 10 bundles of heroin a day. And because of this, they were falling asleep in the halls, and their housing was in jeopardy. I would have specific conversations on how we can reduce the risk, on how we maybe can reduce the use, and maybe not using 5 bundles. Maybe we can use 1 bundle and not use alone. And so if you fall asleep, you have somebody there with you who could wake you up and pull you in the apartment. So these kind of conversations is what harm reduction allows us to do. Harm reduction also applies substance use, mental health, and other behavioral health concerns. So harm reduction, it applies to substance use, mental health, and other behavioral health concerns. I talked about how we use harm reduction in regards to substance use, but as well as mental health. We have conversations with our participants, with our individuals that we work with around mental health. A lot of participants don't want to, they don't want to take medications. And so we work with and we have conversations with them around different practices and strategies that they could use without using medications. So harm reduction does all of those things. And now we will talk about what harm reduction doesn't do. There are a lot of myths on what harm reduction doesn't do. So let's break them down. So harm reduction does not mean anything goes. It does not mean that our clients will never experience any consequences for their actions. We are not that powerful. We also have to remember that choice does not mean absolute choice. So I talked about how our participants, how the people that we we support, they deal with natural consequences. If a participant is being unruly in the apartment building that they live in and they are just disrupting their neighbors, then they they may get on the radar, the landlord's radar, and the landlord may threaten eviction or threaten to put them out. So there's like a natural consequence that even as service coordinators or service workers, we cannot restrict. We cannot like save our participants from these natural consequences. And so harm reduction does not mean anything goes. Harm reduction also, it doesn't endorse or encourage drug use or high-risk behaviors. Harm reduction does not exclude or dismiss abstinence-based treatment models as viable options. Clients make their own decisions. Our participants, the people we serve, they make their own decisions and observe the results. The next steps belong to the participants. Change can take months and may entail many failures, but we do not exclude or dismiss abstinence-based treatment models as viable options. I talked about how a lot of our participants, a large percentage of the people we serve who engage in substance use, once they obtain housing and they get their needs met, they have this case management services wrapped around them, and they have some stability. They themselves make the choice to get involved in some abstinence-based treatment models, such as like Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous. So harm reduction doesn't exclude. And when our participants come to us and they want, they want to engage in these abstinence-based treatments, we very much walk alongside them. I have had the pleasure of accompanying plenty of participants to Narcotics Anonymous meetings, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. So harm reduction doesn't exclude these abstinence-based treatment models as viable options. We just include harm reduction practices as well. Harm reduction doesn't attempt to minimize or ignore the harms associated with licit and illicit drug use, sexual activities, or other risks. Oops, I'm sorry. Let me go back for 1 second. I went too far. It's very important to understand that us as staff, we don't take over in times of hardship. The people that we serve, the people who will be housed in your facilities, they become better prepared to make the sound decisions in the future when they have the opportunity to practice decision making. So like I said, once they get some stability, once they have their needs met and have some services wrapped around them, they make the decision to change their lives and make positive changes within their lives. I know it can be very frustrating for us as providers and the participant. It could take a lot of trial and error for changes to actually occur, but we always revert to the most important question of how can we help? How can we walk alongside you? How can we help with the goals that you set for yourselves? All right. I'll pass it right back to you, Ryan.
Thanks. I think this is a good slide. Also, before I move on, to kind of tap into way back in the beginning of our discussion today, Mark was wanting to see like a contrast between harm reduction based program ways and non-harm reduction ones. This concept that Renee drilled into of like, harm reduction doesn't mean anything goes. Sometimes choices become limited as people continue to make choices that are like harmful to other people or are going to put their own housing at risk, for example. I think this is in contrast. This idea of natural consequences is in contrast to what I see out in the kind of drug and alcohol treatment world of kind of program enforced consequences, where it's like extra consequences. Oh, you didn't do, you didn't maintain your sobriety, or you picked up this number of times or whatever. Thus, your privileges are restricted in certain ways, right? That's not a natural consequence. That's a very that only exists in this very kind of insular world of treatment. Here in a harm reduction context, we're saying one natural consequence of, here's a frequent example that happens in our housing complex. People who are no longer homeless want to bring all their friends with them, right? They live in community when they're unsheltered, then they get housed. Now like 6 other people are living in this unit because they were all unhoused, right? That's going to end up, one natural consequence is if the landlord finds out like 7 people are living in this unit, but only 1 is paying rent, that's going to be a problem, right? They're going to get evicted at some point or some other way of getting them out. That would be a natural consequence. You or I would face that consequence if we were leasing and had more people living in the unit than the landlord knew and they found out about it, right? These are the kinds of things that people can and will face through stressful events. But when we start to limit people's privileges, that sort of paternalistic view of what care should be is going to cause more problems than it solves. And it doesn't align with harm reduction. So just wanted to add that and make that contrast. Harm reduction is about safety. We've talked about this a bit already. And I like this quote. It's from a program model. It's an evidence-based program model that was meant to help people who are dealing both with post-traumatic stress disorder and substance use. And so it's this manual meant to help support people in that way. So Lisa Najavitz said, just as violations of safety are life-destroying, the means of establishing safety are life-enhancing. Those violations, I think we can call those traumas, right? Those violations of our safety, our traumas. When we can establish our own safety, she's saying that ultimately enhances our lives, right? And so we view harm reduction strategies, tools, Narcan. Narcan is a medicine that can reverse an overdose of an opioid. That's a harm reduction tool. That's life enhancing. A, because it's literally saving a life, but B, because it's giving people the tools to establish greater safety in their lives, right? And so that's really what at the core of a lot of these harm reduction interventions that we engage in. Here's an example that sometimes happens. People leave drug paraphernalia out on their floors in their apartments, right? They live alone. It's their apartment. They can do what they want. I live alone. I actually don't live alone. If I did live alone, my place would probably be a lot messier than it is, for one. But also, I could do what I want with my place, right? That's true for our participants as well. What we do to help people is give them sharps containers, for example. You can dispose of your paraphernalia in this way. That's going to be safer for you. You're not going to step on needles. You can have guests over. That will be great. That's life enhancing from our view. I see a question. What happens if a relative comes to visit someone in the 21 units? Great question. What happens when a relative comes and visits you? I'm being a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think that's the perspective that we should have. These are people who live in an apartment of their own. There's not really a need for a bunch of extra rules to get them to live a certain way from our perspective as Housing First providers. Now, if those relatives come and stay permanently, that's going to jeopardize their tenancy if their lease is based on a single occupant, right? And that would be true in our program too. You have a one-person lease. You can't have your whole family, relatives come and live here too, right? And that's a violation of the lease. When I break my lease, I have problems with my landlord. When our participants break their lease, they have problems with their landlord. Same deal. Okay. I'm going to breeze through this, but this is really meant for social workers. There is a way that we practice called trauma-informed care. which sort of recognizes the reality of how common trauma is out in the world. It allows us to understand what are the signs and symptoms of trauma. And then we build policies and care procedures that are responsive to that trauma. That's what trauma-informed care really is. And so trauma-informed care is also pretty focused on safety. Remember, our definition of trauma was a loss of safety and a loss of control, right? And so when we practice in a trauma-informed way, that is inherently safer for the person that we're serving. So harm reduction attempts to be trauma-informed as well. All right, Renee, take us through the goals and limitations of harm reduction practice.
Sure. Thank you. So let's talk about like the goals and the limitations of practicing harm reduction. So one of the goals of practicing harm reduction is meeting the needs of the people you work with, some of whom may engage in some high-risk behaviors. And so what that means, it means that we meet people where they're at, and we try to keep them alive long enough to help them make a change. And so another goal is saving lives, and they're both connected, meeting the needs and saving lives. And one thing to keep in mind is that dead people can't recover. So we can't help anyone who has overdosed. We can't help people if they are not alive. And so when we practice harm reduction, we are meeting the needs of the people we work with, and we are also wanting to save their lives. Now, there are some limitations that come along with practicing harm reduction, and what gets in the way of practicing harm reduction. One of the things is being uncomfortable. We talked about this. I think it was one of the first slides in our presentation today. We talked about having uncomfortable conversations and being uncomfortable talking about drug use, talking about mental health symptoms, talking about like sex work or any other type of risky behaviors that the people we work with sometimes engage in. Another limitation to practicing harm reduction is the not having experience with these issues. So the disparities in lived experiences. And this is why peer specialists, certified peer specialists, certified recovery specialists, community health workers. This is why people with lived experience working on the teams are so important. They can often make connections that others are unable to forge. And I will speak for myself as a certified peer specialist. I pride myself very much on being able to relate to the people that I work with, and being able to make these unique kinds of relationships, these unique types of the rapport building relationships that I'm able to have with the participants. And it's simply because we relate on some of the same lived experiences. So people with lived experiences are very important. And when you don't have people with lived experience, it could be a limitation to harm reduction. Another limitation is the preoccupation with criminal activity. So sometimes people who work in the field, they get worried about the legality of discussing certain behaviors. So they get worried that talking about selling drugs or using drugs because they're against the law, they get worried about having these kind of conversations with their clients, with the people that they work with. And they don't want to seem like they're condoning illicit activity and possibly jeopardizing their jobs or their licenses. And I promise you that will never be the case. Just because you're having these conversations, these much needed, important conversations with the people you're working with, you are never jeopardizing or putting your job at risk. Another one of limitations to practicing harm reduction is this savior complex. Some people get into the behavioral health world. Some people get into the helping field because they feel like we need to save people. They have this passion for wanting to save people. And it is very important to understand that people don't want to be saved by us. They want to save themselves. They want to have the ability, the opportunities to make the decisions to better their own lives. They want to save themselves. And then last but not least, our personal values. Sometimes our personal values can get in the way of practicing harm reduction. I know as a certified peer specialist, a lot of my colleagues have a difficult time working under a harm reduction model because as a certified peer specialist, we are trained to work alongside people through their recovery. Well, harm reduction says that people don't have to be in recovery. And so sometimes our personal values, our judgments and stigmas can rear up inside of us. And it takes practice to check our personal opinions at the door. The reason we're all doing this work is to help others and to be of their service. And we can't do that effectively if we let our own opinions get in the way. So those were the goals and the limitations of practicing harm reduction. And now let's talk about some outcomes. Let's talk about the outcomes of harm reduction. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. Okay, so let's talk about the harm reduction, the outcomes of harm reduction. So one of the outcomes is the ability to increase trust with the clients, with the people that we work with, and foster engagement. Another outcome of harm reduction is to improve public health for individuals and in the community. We talk about like SSP, sterile syringe programs, which benefit not only individuals, but the community as a whole. And then another outcome of harm reduction is it challenges stigma. It challenges the stigma around substance use. It challenges the shame that people deal with, the stress that people deal with in regards to the stigma around substance use. Another incredibly important outcome around harm reduction is that it is cost effective. So the estimated lifetime cost for persons who become HIV infected at, let's say, around the age of 35 is $300,000, whereas the cost of a sterile syringe is approximately between $1 and $3. And we also know that harm reduction and safe syringe programs work. So here in Philly, we saw a 34% decrease in the transmission of new HIV infections of the drug injecting population in Philadelphia following the opening of Prevention Point. And Prevention Point here in Philly is a sterile syringe program that provides sterile syringes and other harm reduction services to our residents of Philly. And this facility opened back in 1991. And since then, here in Philly, we have seen a 34% decrease in the transmission of new HIV infections. And so I will pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Renee. This slide is really thinking about how we measure success. There is a lot of technical information that I typically share to a social service provider audience. But for us tonight, I'll just say that we conducted a small internal study on our site for people who are using medication for opioid use disorder. In other words, people who are using Suboxone to manage their opioid diagnosis. And they talked about what was important to them, right? We often talk about like outcomes from our perspective. You know, I'm going to make sure people are housed. We're a housing provider. I want to make sure people are living healthily in whatever way that can be. I have sort of a lot of things that I want for the people that we serve. And so we asked them the question, like, what about you? How would you measure success in a program like this? And the three boxes at the bottom are the kind of three most typical answers that came out as themes. Folks wanted to have a sense of optimism. They wanted to be happy and have a sense of self-worth. This is what folks are looking for in a harm reduction context or in a PSH housing program, right? People also said that they didn't want physical dependence on substances. They didn't want to be reliant on this thing. And I think when people are dealing with addiction, it has a pretty tight grasp, such that like people can't even, I don't know, we talked about going to get hospital care. They can't stay for an overnight to get the care that they need because it's going to make them feel too sick, right? So people don't like having that. And then this one, I think, brought a tear to my eye when I first read it, but people simply want stable housing, the ability to shower, and the ability to stay neat. This is not something that folks who have lived unsheltered for some length of time have been able to have, right? Just the ability to take a shower. I take a shower every day, and I don't think a whit about it. It's not that big a deal to me, right? Some folks, this is one of the primary things that they're looking for to improve the quality of their lives. And so I guess in that, I'll say what you're doing, this community that you're bringing on board, is really important. And it's going to have huge, huge impact for 21 individuals, right? And it's going to be the small things that you don't even think about that's going to be so impactful for them. Responding to Robbie's comment, where did the concept of harm reduction originate? We talked about that a bit on the history of harm reduction slide. So once I send these slides out, I think you'll see, I think our thought is that it really comes from kind of mutual aid that has been practiced for many, many, many years. And we've sort of co-opted it, called it harm reduction, and sort of pretended like it comes from social workers, and it doesn't. It comes from people, it comes from communities. Great. Okay, let's do a little review here, and then I want to kind of open it up for some discussion and thoughts and comments. Here's a quote that I want to share with you from Dylan Stanley, who I think used to work for Harm Reduction Ohio. I don't know if he still does. Dylan said, "Harm reduction is no place for ego. It's a place to forget what you think you know and set aside your opinion so that when you meet people where they're at, you can take the time to ask them where they want to go." I think for me, the purpose of this, the point of this quote is that we are not going to get to decide how other people should live their lives. And we shouldn't want that power, I don't think. Telling people what to do is going to end up pushing them away, especially if they're not ready to take those suggestions, right? Live this way. Do this with your body. That's going to create distance, right? Instead, when we're open and we're accepting of people, maybe not accepting of their behavior always, but certainly accepting of them as individuals, that's going to invite people to engage further with us. And we can continue to help like identify ways to live safer and healthier lives when that door is open. So just it's more around non-judgment, I think.
All right. So before we get into our discussion, just want to point out the two main goals of harm reduction. First one being safety. We talked about how one of the main goals is saving lives, helping people to get their needs met, but also saving lives. And we also talked about how a dead person can't recover, how we can't help a dead person recover. So providing safety, helping individuals understand the risk that they're taking, and possibly having discussions around lessening the risk definitely relates to one of the main goals of harm reduction, which is safety. The other goal of harm reduction is bodily autonomy, allowing the people that we work with to make the decisions in regards to their life, understanding that people have the ability to steer their lives in the direction that they want to. No matter if we feel that it's the right way to go, it's very important to understand that people are able to make to set goals for themselves and work on achieving them, and that we are only there to walk alongside them, to have suggestions, and to just be there to help get their needs met. But to understand that the two main goals of harm reduction is one, safety, and two, bodily autonomy for the people that we work with. And so some key takeaways before we, get into some questions, comments, or anything of that nature. Just some important key takeaways in regards to harm reduction. Our participants are the experts on their own lives and experiences. It's our job to honor their autonomy, to honor their self-determination and their choice. We need to understand that behavior serves a function, even risky behavior. People use drugs or engage in other risky behaviors for all types of reasons. And what we need to do is get curious as to why those reasons are. And then stigma and shame hurt vulnerable people. Stigma and shame hinder connection and decrease safety. It's important to understand that we all use harm reduction in our lives. We all engage in risky activities, and we all use harm reduction strategies in our lives. Harm reduction is a nuanced practice that requires creativity, patience, and empathy. We'll make mistakes and we'll need to go back to the drawing board. We cannot do this work in isolation. Providers must be consistent, reliable, and non-judgmental. And it is our job to keep the doors open for those most in need of our assistance and continually invite them into the treatment process or into a process, into a helping process. We have to get comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. We talked about how it's very important to have these conversations, even if it doesn't feel natural for us. Our feelings and our values have to be decentered in this work. And then last but not least, redefine success and celebrate more often. Success in harm reduction work, it doesn't always or often looks like someone achieving total abstinence. It might just be someone changing their socks daily rather than once a week. And we need to celebrate any small successes and any incremental move towards change. Righty, we made it to the question and answer slides. All right.
Yeah, this is a good time. Let's open the floor up. I know folks have some things probably we won't be able to solve or make you feel comfortable with today. But I wanted to start with saying, yes, we did talk quite a bit about drugs today. I think that is a part of homelessness. There are other things about homelessness. If I could leave you with one thing, I would say this approach, this way of being with people in a harm reduction context, I think applies well beyond drug use, right? It's about decisions that people make, choices that people make, and how we respond. Interrupting processes of stigma and shame, and allowing people the autonomy to make the choices that they're going to make and help support them with tools to be healthier and safer. That's not always about drug use. I think for us, it's an easy place to start to have this conversation because it's concrete and understandable. Elena, I think your name is pronounced. Please, I see your hand up. Hit us.
If you're talking, Elena, we're not hearing you.
Oh yeah, sorry, Elena. I can't see your face, so you're still muted if you're talking. I love the little zoom hand, by the way. Taking all the other questions too, if other folks have their.
Okay.
Oh, there you are. I hear you. Yeah, there you are. Go ahead.
I just played with all the buttons. I think it's really important to remember, I work with a supportive housing community right now, 50 plus a housing community. And I think it's really important for us to remember that it's not our job to solve their problems, that it's not our job to fix whatever's wrong, that our job is really to just provide community. And I say that from experience because every time I meet with my folks that I've known for over 3 years, there's things that I want to do. There's money that I want to give them. There's things that I want to provide. And I know not only is that not sustainable, but it's not what I'm there to do. What I'm there to do is let them know that they have people who understand them, that will sit and listen to them. I had a lady the other day who all she wanted was somebody to listen. She had never had somebody just listen to her story. And, you know, in a non-judgmental way, and I had to bite my tongue about, well, maybe I think you should do that or do the other thing or what, you know, And in my mind, I'm like, okay, that's giving her advice, but that's not what she wants. And that's not really what I'm here to provide. So honestly, it was during the eclipse too. So we sat there and she just talked and talked and talked. And after about an hour or so, she thanked me because she said nobody has ever really listened to her before. And that's all she wanted to do. So I think it's really important for us to remember it is not our place to solve their problems or come up with resources. We can get them in touch with caseworkers. We can, say, talk to so-and-so about this, that, and the other thing. But other than that, we're just there to be their friends and hang out and have a good time. So
I
I think
love it. That's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And if I could just add one more adjective of what you're there to be, or like a one other way of understanding how to be, is think about how you are as a neighbor yourself in the community that you live in. That's literally who you are, right? You're a neighbor for these people. And I think when you're struggling to know, what do I do or say to this person? What would you do or say to your next door neighbor? Might be one starting point. But I love your ideas there, Elena, and I think you're right on track. I'm right on the same page as you. Other thoughts or questions? I wonder if anything that you heard today was challenging. Um, did you struggle with any of it? Are you curious? Are you more curious? I did see that there are some requests for reading material. I think what we can do is, I don't have anything that's really popping off the top of my head right now. And so what I will do is put together a short list of some things that I'll try to include in some follow-up materials if you'd like to dig a little deeper.
I have a remedial question.
Go for it.
How do you break this chain of shame, do you think?
I think it's a lot of the stuff that we talked about today around acceptance of the person, if not the behavior, right? I think it's about this non-judgmental attitude. Sometimes it's as simple as not, I don't know about you. Is your name Jeff?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but when somebody tells me something surprising, you can see it all over my face. Ooh, oh my goodness. You did what? I think this is going to sound so simple, but sometimes what we need to do is just be a little non-reactive to things that freak us, right? It's to let people know, hey, well, that's pretty wild. What else you got, right? Oh, did you see the eclipse too? Right? Like sometimes it's a little bit about not getting scared off when we hear something that's surprising. And sometimes what it's about is giving people enough. I think one of the things that you're already doing as a community by setting up this housing is giving people another chance, right? Which I think is inherently a bit of an attack on some of the shame that people may feel by being unsheltered and unhoused and not having somebody who was willing to give them another chance. It's a good question. I don't know if I have a much more thoughtful answer than that right in the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Good. Thank you. What other thoughts or questions are coming up for people? As you're thinking of thoughts and questions, I just wanted to drop a link to the course evaluation in the chat. We'd just love feedback. And maybe that'll be a chance for you to kind of stew on some of this and think of new questions. There's a place that you can put some additional questions in that course evaluation, but just want to kind of know how things are sitting with you. I see Lori dropping a podcast in the chat for people who want to kind of dig a little deeper. And John is giving us the reminder that our next training together is going to be on May 20th at 6 p.m., another Monday. And we're going to dig into the Housing First philosophy. What is Housing First? How does it work? Elena, I see your hand raised. Go for it.
Yeah, I also wanted to say, I know people are having trouble, asking questions. I'm sure they're very overwhelmed. So, but one of the things that I would suggest they think about is how they want to be in community. What do they think it means to be in community? We just had an outing. Nancy Nance was actually there. with two of my folks from the senior community. We went to a couple of events at Charlotte Shout. Unfortunately, it was raining, so we had to pivot, but it gave us a perfect opportunity to sit down. We sat down and had lunch. We talked to them, found out a lot more about them than I had ever known. And it was, it was the ability for us to just pivot and come up with things. Like I came up with the Charlotte Shout because they all said that they were bored. And so I said, okay, well, let's get us into Charlotte and see what we can figure out. And happened to be doing Charlotte Shout, had some really interesting events. So I think that that's something that we all can think about. What would be interesting? What would be fun? What would allow us to hang out and just, be who we are? Some new ideas that they may not have thought of and that are occurring to us. So that might be something for people to think about.
I love that idea. What does it mean to be community? I think is kind of your prompt. And that's great. And can I suggest too that thinking about this harm reduction content, there was one slide where we looked at harm reduction principles, and one principle is participant involvement. At some point, now's not the time yet, but at some point, maybe it's worth bringing the community of residents into that conversation with you. What does it mean for us all to be in community, right? So it's not just a one-way street there, but a conversation.
Can you all hear me? I just had to change to my cell phone.
Sure can, yep.
So one thing that I think has always been a little bit that it's a little complicated is the term of non-judgmental, because I think what folks mean when they talk about non-judgmental is that it is not canceling, like that we do not do canceling behaviors. We do not do, it's not, you didn't attend this Bible study, so you lose your housing. Because there is, I think what people get hung up on a lot in conversations that I have with people is that I may still have a value judgment. Like if you are, as you were talking, Renee, like 10 bundles of heroin, like I may have some judgment about 10 bundles of heroin. But it is not a condemning, like the relationship perseveres, I think, is the important thing. And we have a real Christian call for that as well.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Like the kind of just spending time defining what is non-judgment. And I think you're right on. It means that we're not bringing consequences to bear because of those value differences, right? It's you're doing this, and so my behavior towards you becomes more negative in some way. And in a context like this one, the providers and the church community itself hold a degree of power over the people that are living there, right? As the leaseholder or as the service provider, the roof above folks, right? And so judgmental behavior is going to have these consequences that are shaded with that power. I can take away your housing because you did this thing that I don't like, right? So yeah, I like your context there. I think it was that Mark that was talking, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah, all right, that was me.
Contributing that. Appreciate that. Want to also shout out, I know this is a lot and a long session that we had, and I think you might have more questions that come up. So I want to give a shout out that in addition to the two sort of formal training sessions that we also have on deck, although not scheduled yet, I think, two kind of 1 hour Q&A sessions. as just a chance to have a little bit less formal of a dialogue, right? No slides. It's a chance to kind of just sit together. So we're going to put that on the calendar at some point. And I think Elena's conversation around like what does it mean to be in a community, that's worth digging into there. Understanding our role and the privilege and power that we have as like leaseholders, I guess you could call yourselves. What does that mean? And how do you be in that role moving forward? I think are all worth exploring, and maybe other questions will come up too. So that's on deck. Don't feel like you need to get all your questions out there right now. For now, it's 9:01. Complete your course eval, and if you have another question that you want to stick in there in your course eval, I think feel free to do that, and I'll try to respond. If you want to reach out to us directly with a question, would be happy to respond over email or phone. Yeah, I'm looking at the last couple comments here. Rachel says, since our society is so focused on legality and liability, we'll need to talk about people engaging in illegal behaviors on our campus and what the consequences for the church as a business entity. Yeah, I think Renee's kind of limitations of harm reduction comment was really focused on a service provider that, they're not going to lose their license just because somebody's doing something illegal. But I do think that there could be community pushback when there's illegal behavior happening on campus. And what does that mean for the church? Absolutely. Yep. We do sometimes do role play, and I think we could take the opportunity to do a little bit of that role play in some of our Q&A sessions. Yeah. All right, folks. I just want to say thank you so much for hanging in there with us. It's been a long 3 hours, but you did great. You were with us to the very end. Thank you so much for your energy and your comments, and I love the project that you all are involved in. So I think have a great rest of your night. Looking forward to seeing you on May 20th.
Yes, enjoy your evening, everyone. Thank you so much.